They say a king without a kingdom is just a man with expensive scars. But when that king is an alpha wolf bleeding out in the wilderness, hunted by the very court he built with blood and bone, survival stops being about the crown. It becomes about whether you still remember how to be human when the empire you conquered decides you're easier to erase than to follow. This is the story of a ruler who learned that absolute power means absolutely nothing. When the people you trusted most are the ones sharpening the knives. Stick around till the end, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments so I know my pack is listening. You're going to need to see how this ends. The assassination attempt happened during the Harvest Moon Gathering, which meant Draven Kaelthorn should have seen it coming from 1,000 miles away. Politics in the kingdom of Varynth operated on a simple principle. The moment you stopped looking over your shoulder was the moment someone drove a blade between your ribs. The Harvest Moon brought every territorial lord, every ambitious alpha, every power-hungry bastard with a manufactured smile into Blackthorn Keep under the pretense of celebration. Wine flowed like rivers. Silk banners snapped in the autumn wind. Musicians played instruments worth more than most wolves earned in a lifetime. And beneath all that civilization, murder breathed like a living thing. Draven stood on the obsidian balcony overlooking the grand hall, watching 300 guests pretend they weren't fantasizing about his death. At 32, he'd ruled Varynth for 9 years through a combination of military genius and calculated brutality that made weaker men wake up screaming. The crown sat heavy on his head tonight, not from weight, but from the knowledge that half the people drinking his wine had already chosen his replacement. Power taught you things the history books never mentioned. It taught you that loyalty expired the second maintaining. It became inconvenient. It taught you that every handshake carried the potential for poison. It taught you that the higher you climbed, the more creative people became about engineering your fall. The truth about dominance that most alphas never lived long enough to understand was this. Strength didn't protect you from betrayal. Strength invited it. Because every ambitious wolf in the kingdom looked at the throne and thought the same thing. If he could take it, why can't I? Draven had built his empire on the corpses of men who'd asked themselves that question. But corpses had a way of multiplying when you ruled through fear alone. Kill one traitor, and 3 more started sharpening their knives in the shadows. Execute a conspirator, and his family spent the next decade plotting revenge. Power was a disease that infected everyone it touched, turning loyalty into a performance and trust into a liability you couldn't afford. He'd learned that lesson the hard way. 7 years ago, his closest friend and military advisor, a wolf named Kieran Ashford, had tried to poison him during a campaign celebration. They'd fought side by side for 3 years, shared meals, strategies, secrets. Draven had trusted Kieran the way brothers trusted each other, right up until Kieran slipped Nightshade into his victory wine and waited for him to die. Draven had survived because paranoia was cheaper than coffins. He'd noticed the bitter scent, switched goblets with a servant at the last second, watched Kieran's expression shift from anticipation to horror as the wrong man started convulsing. The interrogation afterward revealed the depth of the conspiracy. Kieran hadn't acted alone. He'd coordinated with 5 other officers, 2 noble families, and a rival alpha from the Eastern Territories. Draven executed all of them personally, not in anger, in necessity, because the second you showed mercy to traitors was the second every ambitious wolf in the kingdom started calculating whether they could succeed where others failed. That massacre had earned him the title whispered in corners and taverns across Varynth, the Iron Wolf. A king who felt nothing, trusted no one, ruled through violence so absolute that even contemplating rebellion felt like suicide. The reputation served its purpose. It kept people afraid. It maintained order. It prevented the kind of chaos that tore kingdoms apart from the inside. But it also made him profoundly, devastatingly alone. Lord Malric Duskbane appeared at Draven's elbow, like smoke materializing into flesh. Tall, silver-haired, with eyes the color of frozen steel, Malric had spent 15 years positioning himself as the second most powerful alpha in the kingdom. He smiled with too many teeth. "You're brooding again, my king. The guests are starting to wonder if you've grown bored with their company." Draven didn't look at him. "I'm wondering how many of them are planning to kill me before sunrise." Malric laughed, a sound engineered to communicate ease. "Paranoia doesn't suit a conqueror, Draven. You've unified territories that spent centuries at war. You've executed every serious threat to the throne. The kingdom is stable. Perhaps it's time to stop seeing enemies in every shadow. The kingdom is stable because I see enemies in every shadow. Draven's voice carried the flat certainty of someone who'd survived a dozen assassination attempts. The second I stop looking is the second the shadows win. Malric's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his gaze. A king who trusts no one eventually becomes a king worth betraying. Draven turned to face him fully, studying the other alpha with the same intensity he'd used to assess enemy positions before battle. Malric was dangerous precisely because he understood power at a level most nobles never reached. He didn't operate through crude violence or obvious scheming. He maneuvered through implications, suggestions, carefully planted doubts that eroded confidence from within. Is that a threat, Malric? It's an observation. Malric's voice remained smooth as poisoned honey. You've spent 9 years building an empire held together by fear. But fear has a shelf life, my king. Eventually, people stop being afraid and start being resentful. And resentment is far more dangerous than any blade. Then it's fortunate I've built my reign on more than fear. Have you? Malric tilted his head slightly, the gesture almost sympathetic. Because from where I'm standing, you've become so focused on eliminating threats that you've forgotten what you're actually protecting. An empire without purpose is just organized violence waiting to collapse. Draven felt his wolf rising beneath his skin, territorial and aggressive. Every alpha recognized the sensation of being challenged, the electric tension that preceded either submission or bloodshed. Malric was testing boundaries, measuring resistance, searching for weakness like a predator probing for soft tissue beneath armor. The political dance had rules older than the kingdom itself. Challenge too directly, and you forced a confrontation that ended in blood. Challenge too subtly, and the insult went unnoticed. Malric walked that line with the precision of someone who'd spent decades perfecting the art of calculated disrespect. This conversation is over, Draven said, voice dropping into command mode that made lesser wolves drop their eyes automatically. Return to the gathering, smile, drink, pretend you're not scheming. Malric bowed with exaggerated courtesy that bordered on mockery. As my king commands. He vanished back into the crowd, leaving Draven alone with the uncomfortable knowledge that Malric was right about one thing. 9 years of ruling through intimidation had created a kingdom full of people who obeyed orders but felt no genuine loyalty. They feared the crown. They respected the power. But they didn't actually care whether Draven Kaelthorn lived or died. Some of them actively preferred the latter. That realization tasted like ash and old blood. Draven had conquered territories, unified fractured wolf packs, eliminated threats with surgical precision. He'd done everything a king was supposed to do to maintain order and project strength, and somehow he'd ended up ruling a kingdom that would celebrate his funeral. The thought should have bothered him more than it did, should have sparked anger or hurt or some emotional response beyond the cold calculation that had become his default setting. But 9 years of constant vigilance had burned out the parts of him that felt things beyond tactical necessity. Love was a liability. Trust was a weapon enemies used against you. Compassion got you killed. He'd learned those lessons written in the blood of people who'd made the mistake of believing otherwise. The first course of the feast was roasted venison prepared by chefs imported from territories Draven had conquered 4 years ago. The meat was seasoned with herbs that probably cost more than a farmer's annual income. Crystal goblets held wine from vineyards Draven owned but had never visited. Everything was excessive, expensive, designed to remind the nobility that the king controlled resources they could only dream of accessing. Draven barely tasted any of it. He sat at the head of a table long enough to seat 40 wolves, watching power dynamics play out in real time. Lord Castellan laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't funny, the nervous energy of someone trying too hard to appear relaxed. Lady Varynth touched the arm of General Halvard with calculated intimacy, building alliances through sexuality, the way other nobles built them through marriage contracts. Young Lord Brennan drank himself into oblivion while his father watched with undisguised contempt. The eternal dance of disappointment between generations. Every gesture meant something. Every conversation concealed a secondary negotiation. Politics was a language spoken in smiles and implications, and Draven had become fluent through necessity rather than preference. Commander Rourke stood positioned near the eastern entrance. expression professionally neutral, while his eyes tracked every movement in the hall. Rourke had served as head of Draven's personal guard for 6 years, surviving 3 separate purges that had eliminated other officers suspected of disloyalty. He was competent, ruthless when necessary, and possessed the kind of paranoia that kept kings alive. Draven trusted him approximately 15% more than everyone else, which meant he trusted him barely at all. Trust was a luxury Draven couldn't afford. Not after Kieran, not after discovering that the people closest to you were often the ones most motivated to destroy you. Proximity to power corrupted faster than distance ever could. Lady Seraphine Blackwood approached his throne with the kind of confidence that came from generations of aristocratic breeding and enough political maneuvering to make Machiavelli look like an amateur. She was beautiful in the way weapons were beautiful, sharp, cold, precisely crafted to inflict damage. Her dress cost enough to feed a village for months. Her smile suggested she knew exactly how much power her appearance wielded. "Your Majesty," she purred, settling into the chair beside him without waiting for permission. The casual boundary violation was deliberate, a test to see if he'd correct her. A magnificent feast. "Though I can't help but notice you seem distracted." Draven regarded her with the same expression he'd used to assess potential battlefield threats. "I'm never distracted, Lady Blackwood. I'm always calculating." How exhausting. She sipped her wine, studying him over the rim of her glass with eyes that missed nothing. "Tell me, do you ever wonder what it might be like to simply exist without constantly preparing for war?" "I exist by constantly preparing for war. It's called survival." "No," she said softly, voice carrying genuine sympathy that felt more dangerous than hostility. "It's called prison. You've become so consumed by protecting your throne that you've forgotten how to actually live. Philosophy from a woman who's spent her entire life manipulating men into positions of power." Draven's voice carried no heat, just observation. "Tell me, Lady Blackwood, which of my enemies are you currently sleeping with?" She laughed, genuinely amused. "All of them, darling. It's called diversifying investments. When you fall, and you will fall eventually, I intend to land somewhere comfortable. At least you're honest about your treachery. Honesty is the only luxury I can afford." She leaned closer, voice dropping to a whisper, meant only for him. "You've built an empire, Draven, but you've made yourself into something inhuman in the process. People don't follow you because they believe in you. They follow you because they're terrified of what happens if they don't. That's not leadership. That's tyranny with better branding. The difference being, leaders inspire loyalty. Tyrants inspire rebellion. And right now, half this room is wondering which of them will be brave enough to put a knife in your back. The other half is wondering how much they'll be rewarded when someone else does it first." Draven studied her face, searching for the lie beneath the confession. He found none. Lady Blackwood spoke truth because she had nothing to lose by being honest. She'd already positioned herself to survive his inevitable downfall, building relationships with every potential successor the same way merchants diversified trade routes. "Why tell me this?" he asked quietly. "Because despite everything, I find you fascinating. You're the most powerful alpha in the kingdom, yet you're completely alone. That's either tragic or terrifying, and I haven't decided which." She paused, something almost human flickering across her expression. "Also because I remember what you were like before the crown ate you alive. You used to laugh occasionally, used to have friends, used to be something other than this perfectly calibrated killing machine wearing expensive clothes. That version of me got people killed, and this version is killing yourself." She finished her wine, setting the goblet down with deliberate care. "I'm not trying to save you, Draven. I'm far too practical for heroic gestures. I'm just telling you what everyone else is too afraid to say. You've won. You've conquered the kingdom. You've eliminated every meaningful threat. But somewhere along the way, you forgot to build anything worth protecting. And an empire without purpose is just geography waiting to be redistributed." Before he could respond, she stood, smoothed her dress, and disappeared back into the crowd with the same calculated grace she'd arrived with. Her words lingered like smoke in an enclosed room. The poisoning happened during the 7th course. Draven noticed the bitter almond scent in his wine before the glass reached his lips. Years of survival instinct screamed danger half a second before conscious thought caught up. Nightshade extract. Concentrated enough to kill an alpha within minutes. The kind of poison you didn't acquire accidentally or prepare without specific murderous intent. He set the goblet down carefully, watching the dark red liquid swirl against crystal. No sudden movements. No visible reaction that might alert whoever was watching for confirmation that their assassination attempt had succeeded. The hall continued its performance of civilization. Nobles laughed at calculated intervals. Musicians played instruments with mechanical precision. Servants moved between tables like shadows, invisible until needed. Nothing appeared wrong. Everything was wrong. Draven's personal guard stood positioned at strategic points throughout the grand hall, loyal soldiers who'd been with him since the early campaigns. But loyalty meant nothing when money or power entered the equation. Anyone could be bought. Everyone had a price. Kieran had taught him that lesson with lethal clarity. He gestured subtly to Commander Rourke, a small hand movement that wouldn't register to anyone not specifically watching for it. The commander approached immediately, expression professionally neutral, playing the role of attendant checking on the king's comfort. "Test the wine," Draven said quietly, voice barely above a whisper. Rourke's eyes flickered with understanding. He took the goblet without question, without hesitation, the smooth efficiency of someone who'd practiced emergency protocols 1,000 times. He disappeared into the crowd, moving toward the kitchens where testing equipment waited for exactly this scenario. 2 minutes felt like hours. Draven continued eating, continued conversing with the noble on his right about grain harvests and trade routes, continued performing the role of king at ease, while internally every combat instinct he possessed screamed warnings. Someone in this room had just tried to murder him. Someone with access to the royal kitchens, knowledge of his seating arrangements, understanding of which vintage he preferred, and the resources to acquire military-grade poison. That narrowed the suspect list to approximately 40 people, which meant approximately 40 people might need to die before morning. Rourke returned with confirmation that validated Draven's instincts. He leaned close, voice low enough that only Alpha hearing could detect it. "Nightshade extract. Enough to kill you within 4 minutes. Concentrated dosage suggests professional preparation." The commander's jaw tightened. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't opportunistic. This was planned, funded, and executed by someone with significant resources. Source? Still investigating. "But my king." Rourke hesitated, a rare display of uncertainty from a man trained to project absolute confidence. This level of sophistication suggests coordination. Multiple people working together. Someone with access to your private preferences. Someone who knew which wine you'd choose tonight. How many people fit that description? In this room? At least 30. Rourke's expression darkened with the grim mathematics of survival. Your personal servants, senior kitchen staff, noble families with connections to the wine suppliers, members of your inner council who attend these events regularly, anyone who's paid attention to your habits over the past 9 years. "So we trust no one." "We trust no one," Rourke confirmed. "Your Majesty, we need to lock down the keep, interrogate everyone with kitchen access, find the traitor before they try again." "No." Draven's voice carried absolute authority despite the whisper volume. "We do nothing. We change nothing. We continue this feast as if nothing happened. Whoever orchestrated this is watching for my reaction. The moment I show weakness or paranoia, they'll know I'm vulnerable. They'll know I'm afraid. With respect, my king, you were nearly murdered." Fear seems like a rational response. Rational and strategic are different things. Draven met his commander's gaze. "If I lock down the keep, I confirm that someone got close enough to rattle me. I show every ambitious alpha in this room that the Iron Wolf can be frightened. That's blood in the water, Rourke. The second they smell it, the feeding frenzy starts." "Then what do you propose?" We smile. We drink from a different goblet. We pretend everything is perfect. Draven's voice dropped even lower. "And we start identifying who looks disappointed that I'm not currently dying on the floor." Rourke's expression suggested he thought this plan was strategically insane, but he'd served long enough to recognize when arguing was futile. When an alpha made a decision, particularly an alpha who'd spent 9 years proving himself unkillable, objections were gestures of concern rather than actual attempts to change outcomes. "As you command, my king." The feast continued for 3 more hours. Draven smiled, conversed, played the role of gracious host, while internally cataloging every micro-expression, every nervous glance, every tell that might identify the traitor. Politics had taught him to read people the way scholars read ancient texts, carefully, suspiciously, always searching for hidden meanings beneath surface narratives. Lord Malric appeared particularly relaxed, which immediately marked him as suspicious. A normal response to a failed assassination would be tension, hypervigilance, the unconscious stress of wondering whether the target had survived. Malric showed none of that. He laughed easily, drank heavily, moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who had nothing to worry about, which meant either he was innocent and genuinely unconcerned, or he was guilty and skilled enough to perform normalcy under pressure. Draven's money was on the latter. Lady Varric drank too much, laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny, the kind of overcompensation that suggested nervous energy burning itself out through forced enthusiasm. General Halvard kept glancing toward the exits, tracking escape routes with the unconscious habit of military training. Young Lord Brennan had vanished entirely, probably passed out drunk in one of the side chambers. Any of them could be guilty. All of them could be guilty. In a court built on ambition and betrayal, everyone was a potential assassin waiting for the right opportunity and sufficient motivation. The question wasn't whether people wanted him dead. The question was who wanted it badly enough to risk everything on a poison attempt that had less than 50% success rate given Draven's well-known paranoia. Someone desperate. Someone with significant resources. Someone who believed they could seize power in the chaos following his death. Someone like Malric. When the gathering finally ended near midnight, Draven retreated to his private chambers with Rourke and 3 guards he trusted marginally more than the others. The obsidian walls of Blackthorn Keep swallowed sound, creating pockets of silence that felt heavier than the stone itself. His chambers occupied the highest tower in the fortress, accessible only through a single spiral staircase designed to be defensible against attacking forces. The windows were narrow slits that provided sight lines while preventing entry. The door was reinforced steel disguised as decorative wood, everything designed to keep the king alive. Everything a reminder that survival required constant vigilance. Options, Draven said, removing the ceremonial crown that had become more burden than symbol. The weight of it left phantom pressure even after he set it down. We could arrest everyone with kitchen access, interrogate them individually. Rourke paced near the window, energy burning through him like caged lightning. Use whatever methods necessary to extract truth. Execute anyone who shows signs of guilt or complicity. And show the entire kingdom that their king is desperate and paranoid. Draven poured himself whiskey from a private supply he kept specifically because servants never touched it. That plays directly into whoever orchestrated this. They want me looking weak. They want me acting frightened. They want the nobility questioning whether I'm still capable of ruling. No. Next option. Increase your personal guard. Triple the security rotations. Food tasters for every meal. Limit access to your chambers. Restrict movement throughout the keep until we identify the conspirators, so I can live like a prisoner in my own fortress. Draven drained the whiskey, welcoming the burn that provided temporary distraction from the situation. That's not ruling, Rourke. That's hiding. The moment I start cowering behind extra guards is the moment every ambitious wolf in the kingdom smells blood. Then what do you propose, my king? Because someone in this keep wants you dead, and they came dangerously close to succeeding tonight. Rourke's frustration leaked through his professional composure. We can't just pretend nothing happened. We can't ignore an assassination attempt and hope the next one fails as well. Draven stared out the window at the kingdom he'd built through blood and calculated violence. Torches flickered across the capital city, sprawling beneath Blackthorn Keep, thousands of lights representing thousands of lives that depended on his ability to maintain order. Somewhere out there, people lived normal lives. They worried about harvests and weather and whether their children would find good mates. They didn't spend every waking moment preparing for assassination attempts orchestrated by people they'd trusted. They didn't understand that power was a cage that looked like freedom from the outside. Maybe Lady Blackwood had been right. Maybe he'd become so consumed by protecting the crown that he'd forgotten what he was actually protecting. An empire built on fear and violence, populated by people who obeyed through intimidation rather than loyalty. Was that worth dying for? Was that worth killing for? I'm going hunting tomorrow, Draven said quietly. In the forbidden territories beyond the capital, just me and the wilderness. No guards, no court, no crown. Rourke stared at him like he'd suggested setting himself on fire and jumping off the tower. My king, that's strategically insane. You'd be completely vulnerable. No guards, no backup, No support if you encounter threats. If the assassins know you've left the keep unprotected, then they'll make their move. Draven turned to face his commander, and we'll finally know who's orchestrating this conspiracy. Because the moment I'm gone, whoever wants the throne will start positioning themselves to take it. They'll get sloppy, they'll get confident, they'll reveal themselves through action instead of hiding behind proxies and poison. You're using yourself as bait. I'm forcing the traitors to reveal themselves. There's a difference. Draven began selecting weapons from the arsenal mounted on his wall. Fear makes people sloppy, Rourke. Anticipation makes them careless. The second they think I'm weak or absent, they'll scramble for power. And when they do, you'll be here watching, taking notes, identifying every bastard who thinks they can claim what I've built. And if they send assassins into the wilderness after you, then I'll handle it the way I've handled every other threat to my reign. Draven pulled down a longbow, tested the string tension, with teeth and claws and enough violence to make the survivors think twice about trying again. The guards exchanged glances that suggested they thought their king had finally lost his mind. Maybe he had. Maybe 9 years of constant paranoia and political maneuvering had eroded his judgment into something resembling tactical suicide. Or maybe he was just tired. Tired of living like a target. Tired of measuring every interaction for hidden daggers. Tired of ruling a kingdom that would celebrate his funeral with the same enthusiasm they currently faked for his continued existence. The Forbidden Territories offered something the throne never could. Simplicity. Threats you could see. Enemies that attacked from the front instead of poisoning your wine when you weren't looking. Survival determined by strength and instinct rather than political calculation. Maybe he'd die out there. Maybe that would be easier than continuing this performance indefinitely. Rourke looked like he wanted to argue further, but recognized the futility. When an alpha made a decision, particularly an alpha who'd spent 9 years proving himself unkillable, objections were gestures of concern rather than actual attempts to change outcomes. "How long will you be gone?" Rourke asked finally, voice heavy with resignation. "As long as it takes." Draven moved toward the weapons wall, selecting knives designed for close combat and a backup bow in case the primary failed. "Tell the court I'm hunting in the Northern Territories. Tell them I needed space to think. Make it sound like arrogance rather than strategy. Make it sound like the Iron Wolf is so confident in his power that he can abandon the throne without consequences. And when they ask when you'll return, tell them the king returns when he chooses, not when courtiers demand it." Draven finished his preparations, looking at the collection of weapons that represented 9 years of surviving assassination attempts. "Tell them I'm reminding the kingdom who built this empire. Tell them whatever you need to maintain order. But watch everyone, Rourke. Watch who celebrates my absence. Watch who starts making moves toward the throne. Watch who looks relieved that I'm gone. I'll watch them all, my king. Good. Because when I return, we're going to execute every traitor we identify tonight." Draven's voice carried the cold certainty of someone who'd made peace with necessary violence. No trials, no mercy, no second chances. "We're going to remind this kingdom what happens when you mistake patience for weakness." He left before dawn, slipping out of Blackthorn Keep through service passages designed for exactly this kind of covert movement. The capital slept beneath heavy clouds that promised rain. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled territorial warnings that echoed across the mountains. Draven shifted into wolf form the moment he reached the forest edge, feeling the transformation ripple through muscle and bone with familiar relief. This body felt more honest than the human one. No pretense, no political masks, just predator instincts and survival drive. The Forbidden Territories existed beyond the ordered civilization of Varynth's capital, where ancient forests stretched thick and hostile across mountains older than the kingdom itself. Most wolves avoided the region. Legends spoke of curses and creatures born from nightmares, old magic that predated the current empire by centuries. Practical wolves understood that wilderness without laws meant death without witnesses. Draven found it peaceful. For the first time in years, he traveled without guards, without advisors, without the constant performance of kingship weighing on his shoulders. Just a man in the forest and the primal satisfaction of moving through terrain that didn't care about crowns or political alliances. His wolf form felt more natural than his human body had in years. Massive black fur that absorbed moonlight. Muscles built for violence and endurance. senses sharp enough to detect threats from half a mile away through scent and sound alone. This was what he'd been before the throne consumed him, a predator optimized for survival rather than a politician optimized for betrayal. He hunted deer through dense pine forests, running them down with the pure satisfaction of physical exertion that demanded nothing except speed and precision. Drank from silver rivers that tasted like stone and ice and minerals older than civilization. Slept beneath stars that didn't demand anything from him except existence. For 3 days, Draven was free. Free from the crown. Free from the constant calculations. Free from measuring every interaction for hidden daggers. The forest didn't care that he was king. It didn't care about his reputation or his military victories or his political genius. It judged him purely on his ability to survive, and survival was something Draven understood at a level deeper than conscious thought. He remembered what it felt like to be just a wolf. Not the iron wolf feared across the kingdom. Not the alpha king who ruled through violence and intimidation. Just a creature moving through wilderness, hunting when hungry, sleeping when tired, existing without the weight of empire pressing down on his shoulders. It felt like remembering how to breathe after years of suffocation. On the 4th night, the assassins found him. Draven had been expecting them. The only question was when they'd arrive and how many would come. Whoever orchestrated the poison attempt wouldn't trust a single failed plan. They'd have backup strategies, contingency protocols, multiple paths toward the same goal: his death. They came during the darkest hours before dawn, professional killers hired from outside the kingdom to avoid connections that might trace back to their employer. 6 mercenaries armed with silver weapons specifically designed to cause maximum damage to shifter physiology. They moved with military precision, surrounding his camp in a coordinated strike pattern designed to eliminate escape routes. Silver was expensive. Silver weapons required specialist forging. The fact that they carried it meant whoever hired them had significant resources and specific knowledge about how to kill an alpha. Draven smelled them before they attacked. Human sweat mixed with weapon oil and the particular scent of men who'd been promised significant payment for a dangerous job. Fear and anticipation created distinct chemical signatures that predator instincts recognized immediately. He shifted to human form, grabbing his bow and moving into defensive position behind a cluster of ancient oaks. Wolf form meant superior strength and speed, but human form meant strategic thinking and weapon usage. Against 6 trained killers, strategy mattered more than raw power. The first arrow took down the lead mercenary before the man finished drawing his sword. Clean shot through the throat that dropped him without sound. The second arrow went through another's eye socket as he tried to flank from the left. The wet thud of impact followed by the heavy collapse of dead weight. Draven moved through the forest like smoke, using terrain and darkness to his advantage. Years of military campaigns had taught him how to use environment as a weapon. The mercenaries were good, well-trained, well-equipped, coordinated in their approach, but they were fighting on his territory using tactics he'd spent decades perfecting. A crossbow bolt tore through Draven's shoulder, spinning him sideways. Pain exploded bright and vicious, the specific agony of silver burning through shifter flesh. Another bolt grazed his ribs, drawing blood that steamed in the cold air. He felt his wolf rising in response to injury, instincts screaming to transform and tear through the attackers with claws and teeth. The animal wanted violence, wanted blood, wanted to rip throats out and establish dominance through primal brutality. Draven fought the urge. Human form meant strategy. Wolf form meant rage. And rage made you sloppy, made you vulnerable, made you exactly the kind of target these mercenaries were trained to kill. He killed the 3rd mercenary with a knife to the kidney, the blade sliding between ribs with practiced precision. Twisted it before pulling out, ensuring maximum internal damage. The 4th died with a blade across the throat, arterial spray painting the forest floor dark red. The remaining 2 realized they were outmatched and tried to retreat, professional enough to recognize when a contract turned into suicide, smart enough to value survival over payment, not smart enough to escape. Draven hunted them down methodically, tracking them through the forest with the same efficiency he'd used to track wounded prey. Executed both before they made it 100 yards, quick kills designed for efficiency rather than suffering. When silence returned to the forest, Draven stood bleeding among 6 corpses, breathing hard, ribs screaming from exertion and injury. The crossbow wounds weren't immediately fatal, but they were serious. Silver poisoning would complicate healing, slow his natural regeneration, leave him vulnerable if more attackers arrived. He needed shelter. Needed to extract the silver, needed time to recover before blood loss or infection made the decision permanent. But first he needed answers. Draven searched the bodies with methodical thoroughness, finding evidence that confirmed his darkest suspicions. Royal seals hidden in coat linings, the kind only issued to personnel with direct access to Blackthorn Keep's treasury. Payment markers made of gold stamped with official kingdom insignia. Instructions written in handwriting he recognized immediately, the precise script belonging to someone educated in court calligraphy. Lord Malric Duskbane. Of course, the evidence was circumstantial enough to provide deniability if questioned, but specific enough that Draven recognized it immediately. Malric was too smart to leave absolute proof of conspiracy, but he was also arrogant enough to believe his planning was flawless. The kind of arrogance that came from years of successful political maneuvering without consequences. Draven felt something cold and final settle in his chest. Not anger, not betrayal, just the grim acknowledgement that he'd been right about everything. The court had become compromised. Loyalty was a fiction. The crown made him a target rather than a protector. And the wolf he'd trusted to help maintain order was the same wolf orchestrating his assassination. He needed to return to Blackthorn Keep, confront Malric publicly, execute the traitors before they could consolidate power, restore order through the only language these people understood, absolute, overwhelming force. But first, he needed to stop bleeding. The crossbow wounds weren't fatal, but they were serious enough to require immediate attention. Silver burned through his system like acid, preventing the natural healing that would normally close injuries within hours. Draven stumbled through the forest, vision blurring, each step feeling like moving through deep water. His wolf whined somewhere deep in his consciousness, confused by the pain and the silver poisoning that felt like fire in his veins. The animal wanted to curl up somewhere safe and sleep until the hurt stopped. The human knew that sleeping meant dying. He needed shelter, medical supplies, time. The abandoned hunter's lodge appeared through the trees like salvation made of rotting wood and desperation. Draven had passed it 2 days earlier, marked its location unconsciously the way predators always mapped territory for future use. Single-room construction, stone fireplace, walls solid enough to provide protection from weather, if not from determined attackers. Good enough. He collapsed against the door, human form shaking with blood loss and shock. His shoulder screamed agony. His ribs felt like they were trying to tear themselves out of his chest. Breathing came in ragged gasps that suggested internal damage beyond what he could assess without proper examination. That's when he heard her. A woman's voice, soft and uncertain, speaking from somewhere inside the darkness of the lodge. "Is someone there?" Draven tried to respond, tried to form words that would communicate injury without revealing identity. But exhaustion dragged him under before language cooperated. The last thing he registered before everything went black was the sound of careful footsteps approaching and the scent of someone who smelled like smoke and winter flowers and something he couldn't quite identify. Something that made his wolf wake up despite the blood loss and pain. Something that felt impossibly, dangerously like safety. And beneath that, even more impossible, the faint, unmistakable scent of an Omega in the forbidden territories. Alone. Which made absolutely no sense because Omegas didn't survive wilderness alone, and they definitely didn't end up in abandoned lodges in territories most wolves avoided on principle. His last conscious thought before darkness claimed him completely was the grim certainty that if he died here, at least it wouldn't be from poison served by people pretending to be loyal. At least it would be honest. Consciousness returned in fragments, pain first, silver burning through his veins like molten metal, each heartbeat pushing poison deeper into his system. Then sound. Crackling fire, the soft rustle of fabric, breathing that wasn't his own. Finally, scent. Smoke and winter flowers and something else. Something that made his wolf stir despite the agony radiating from his shoulder and ribs. Omega. The word registered before conscious thought fully returned. His wolf knew it instantly, recognized it at a level deeper than language or logic. Omega meant something fundamental, something coded into predator instincts that predated civilization by millennia. Draven forced his eyes open. The abandoned lodge was smaller than he remembered. single-room construction with walls that had seen better decades. A fire burned in the stone fireplace, casting shadows that danced across rough wooden beams. His weapons lay arranged near the door, cleaned and organized with care that suggested someone had handled them despite not knowing him. And kneeling beside him, carefully wrapping clean cloth around his wounded shoulder, was a woman who shouldn't exist. She was young, maybe 23 or 24, with dark hair that fell past her shoulders in waves that caught the firelight. Pale skin marked with old bruises along her forearms. Delicate hands that moved with practiced efficiency despite the trembling he could detect in her fingers. She wore simple clothing, the kind servants or commoners might own, fabric worn thin from repeated washing. But none of that mattered compared to the detail that made Draven's breath catch despite the pain. She was blind. Her eyes were beautiful, pale gray like morning fog, but they didn't track his movement when he shifted slightly. Didn't focus on anything specific, just stared forward with the particular stillness of someone who'd learned to navigate the world without sight. A blind Omega, alone in the forbidden territories, tending wounds on a stranger who'd collapsed bleeding on her doorstep. None of it made sense. "You're awake," she said quietly, not looking at him but somehow knowing anyway. Her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone accustomed to being hurt by the people around her. "Good. I was worried the silver poisoning was too advanced. You've been unconscious for 6 hours." Draven tried to speak, but his throat felt like sandpaper. The woman seemed to sense his struggle because she moved away, returning moments later with a wooden cup filled with water. She held it to his lips without asking permission, the kind of casual intimacy that suggested she'd done this before. He drank, tasting herbs mixed with the water. Something for pain, something to counter infection. She knew basic field medicine, which raised even more questions about who she was and what she was doing here. "Who are you?" His voice came out rough, damaged from pain and blood loss. She pulled back, settling onto her heels with the cup still in her hands. "I could ask you the same question. You show up bleeding from silver wounds, carrying enough weapons to start a small war and pass out on my doorstep. That's not exactly typical hunter behavior." I asked first. "Fair enough." A small smile touched her lips, there and gone like sunlight through clouds. "My name is Celine. I've been living here for about a week, and before you ask why a blind woman is alone in the forbidden territories, the answer is complicated and none of your business." Draven studied her, searching for deception or hidden agenda. Found neither. Just exhaustion and the particular wariness of someone who'd been hurt enough times to expect it as default. The truth about power that most people never understood was this. Dominance wasn't just about physical strength or political maneuvering. Real dominance meant reading people faster than they could construct lies, meant understanding motivations before they became actions, meant recognizing threats and opportunities in the space between words. Celine radiated neither threat nor opportunity. She radiated survival instinct and bone-deep loneliness, and something else he couldn't quite identify. Something that made his wolf pay attention despite the silver still burning through his system. "Draven," he said finally, "and you're right. The circumstances are complicated. Military?" She tilted her head slightly, listening to something beyond his words. "You move like military. Even injured, your breathing is controlled, disciplined. Most people panic when they're hurt this badly. You're just calculating. Calculating what? Whether I'm a threat. Whether you can trust me. Whether you need to kill me to protect whatever secret brought you into the forbidden territories bleeding from assassin weapons." Her voice remained calm, almost clinical. "The answer to all three is no, by the way. I'm not a threat. You can't trust me because you can't trust anyone, and killing me would be pointless because I have no interest in your secrets." The bluntness caught him off guard. Most people constructed elaborate social performances, layering pleasantries and implications until truth became indistinguishable from manipulation. Celine spoke like someone who'd burned through the patience required for those games. "You're not afraid of me. Should I be?" She stood, moving toward the fireplace with the unconscious grace of someone who'd memorized every inch of the space. "You're wounded, possibly dying from silver poisoning, and I'm the only person within 20 miles who knows basic medical treatment. If you were going to hurt me, you would have done it already. Predators don't waste time on elaborate social rituals when violence is the goal. You know a lot about predators. I know a lot about being prey. She stirred something in a pot suspended over the flames, the scent of herbs and meat filling the small space. Turns out when you spend your entire life being hunted, you develop certain survival skills. Reading intent, identifying threats, knowing when to run and when to freeze. Draven watched her move through the lodge with practiced efficiency despite her blindness. She'd mapped the space completely, turned disability into merely another environmental factor to account for. Most wolves would have dismissed her as weak, vulnerable, useless. Most wolves were idiots who confused visible strength with actual capability. The silver wounds feel worse, don't they? She didn't wait for confirmation. Silver poisoning in shifters creates a specific type of pain, burns from the inside out, makes healing impossible until you extract all the fragments and flush your system. I got most of the crossbow bolt pieces out while you were unconscious, but there might be residual contamination. How do you know about shifter physiology? I pay attention, and I've spent enough time around wolves to recognize the symptoms. She ladled soup into a wooden bowl, brought it over with the same casual efficiency she'd shown with the water. You need food. Your body is burning through resources trying to heal. Protein will help. Draven accepted the bowl, studying her face while she couldn't see him doing it. She was beautiful in an unconventional way, features too sharp to be classically pretty, but compelling in their severity. The kind of face that would be easy to overlook until you actually looked, and then became impossible to forget. But beauty meant nothing compared to the questions multiplying in his mind. A blind Omega alone in the Forbidden Territories made no strategic sense. Omegas were valuable, protected, controlled by families and packs who understood their rarity. They didn't end up abandoned in wilderness unless something catastrophic had happened. "Why are you here?" he asked quietly. Celine settled near the fire, pulling her knees to her chest in a defensive posture that suggested the question touched something painful. "I told you. It's complicated. I've got time. And silver poisoning. Humor me." She was silent for long enough that Draven thought she might refuse to answer. Then she spoke, voice carefully neutral in the way people used when discussing trauma they hadn't fully processed. "My family sold me. Well, my uncle sold me. To a nobleman known for collecting broken things. Servants who'd committed crimes. Omegas no one wanted. People he could hurt without consequences." She traced patterns on the floor with one finger, the gesture unconscious. "I ran before the transaction completed, fled during the harvest moon when everyone was drunk and distracted, ended up here because nowhere else seemed far enough away." The explanation was delivered with the flat effect of someone reciting facts rather than reliving experiences. But beneath the careful control, Draven detected anger, hurt, the complicated grief of being betrayed by people who should have protected her. He understood that grief intimately. "Your uncle sold you because you're blind." "He sold me because I'm cursed. There's a difference." Celine's voice hardened slightly. "Blindness runs in my bloodline, has for generations. People think it means weakness, bad luck, divine punishment for sins committed centuries ago. Having a blind Omega in the family is like advertising that your genetics are compromised. So they get rid of the evidence. By selling you to sadists. By selling me to anyone willing to pay." The sadism was just a bonus feature my uncle didn't bother mentioning. She stood abruptly, pacing toward the window with tension radiating from her shoulders. "But I'm not interested in pity or rescue fantasies, Draven. I survived. I got out. I'm here. That's more than most people in my position can say." The defiance in her voice triggered something in Draven's chest, some recognition of kindred damage. She'd been betrayed by family the same way he'd been betrayed by Kieran, by Malric, by every ambitious bastard who looked at loyalty as a temporary condition rather than fundamental principle. Survival required hardness, required the ability to cut away sentiment and operate from pure strategic necessity. Celine understood that at a level most people never reached. "How long are you planning to stay here?" he asked. "As long as necessary, until I figure out where to go next. Until the nobleman stops looking for me. Until I decide whether survival is actually worth the effort." She turned back toward him, those pale gray eyes somehow finding his position despite not seeing him. "What about you?" Wounded alpha running from assassins doesn't exactly scream long-term camping trip. Draven considered how much truth to share, calculated risks and potential consequences. Decided that honesty was cheaper than elaborate lies when he was too injured to maintain complex deceptions. I'm the king of Varynth. Someone tried to poison me during a feast. When that failed, they sent mercenaries. I'm here because staying in the capital meant dying, and dying meant letting traitors win. Silence crashed through the lodge like physical weight. Celine stared in his general direction, expression shifting through disbelief, calculation, and finally something that looked like grim amusement. You're telling me the Iron Wolf himself collapsed bleeding on my doorstep, and I've been treating him like a random injured hunter. You've heard of me. Everyone's heard of you. The brutal conqueror who unified the territories through violence and intimidation. The alpha who trusts no one and executes traitors before breakfast. The king who supposedly feels nothing except strategic necessity. She laughed, the sound sharp and slightly unhinged. Of course you'd be the one I accidentally rescue. Because my luck is exactly that terrible. I didn't ask to be rescued. You were dying. I had medical supplies and basic human decency. The rescue happened whether you asked for it or not. Celine moved back to the fire, agitation making her movements sharper than before. So what now? You recover here, return to your kingdom, execute everyone involved in the conspiracy, resume being the terrifying ruler everyone fears? That was the plan. Was? Draven set down the soup bowl, studying her profile in the firelight. Being here, away from the court, away from the constant performance of kingship, it reminded me what I was before the crown. Just a wolf trying to survive. No grand destiny, no empire to maintain, just existence without the weight of other people's expectations. Sounds peaceful. It sounds lonely. He paused, recognizing a truth he'd been avoiding for years. The crown isolated me more effectively than any prison. Made me into something that couldn't afford vulnerability or trust or basic connection. I've spent 9 years eliminating threats and wondering why I felt emptier with each execution. Because violence isn't the same as purpose. Celine's voice softened slightly. You built an empire, but you forgot to build anything worth protecting inside it. So now you're a king ruling a kingdom that would celebrate your funeral. That's not power, Draven. That's just organized loneliness with better furniture. The observation cut deeper than any blade because it was accurate. Lady Blackwood had said something similar, but hearing it from Celine, from someone who had no political agenda, no reason to manipulate him, made it impossible to dismiss. You're very comfortable insulting a king. You're very comfortable bleeding in a stranger's lodge. I think we're past formality. She pulled a blanket around her shoulders, settling near the fire. Besides, what are you going to do? Execute me? You can barely stand. I'm not afraid of men who need me more than I need them. The casual dismissal of his authority should have triggered territorial aggression, should have made his alpha instincts demand submission and recognition of hierarchy. Instead, it felt refreshing, honest. The first genuine interaction he'd had with someone in years that wasn't filtered through political calculation. How long have you been alone? He asked. In this lodge? A week. In general? Most of my life. People don't know what to do with blind omegas. We're too vulnerable to function independently, but too damaged to be valuable mates. So we exist in this strange middle space between pity and disgust. Celine stared into the flames. You learn to be comfortable with solitude, or you go insane from loneliness. I chose the former. Draven recognized that choice intimately. The crown had forced him into a similar calculation. Accept isolation as the price of power, or abandon the throne and lose everything he'd built. He'd chosen power, chosen survival, chosen strategic necessity over human connection, and look where that had gotten him. Bleeding in an abandoned lodge, hiding from assassins, questioning whether 9 years of conquest had actually achieved anything meaningful. Your shoulder needs fresh bandages, Celine said, standing and moving toward supplies she kept organized near the far wall. The bleeding has stopped, but infection is still possible if we're not careful. This is going to hurt. Everything hurts. A little more won't make much difference. She approached with clean cloth and something in a small jar that smelled medicinal and vaguely antiseptic. Knelt beside him with the same careful efficiency she'd shown earlier. Unwrapped the old bandage with gentle precision, despite not being able to see what she was doing. Draven watched her work, fascinated by the competence she displayed despite her disability. Most people would fumble, hesitate, require visual confirmation for each step. Celine moved with the confidence of someone who'd learned to trust other senses completely. "This is going to burn," she warned, opening the jar. The salve hit his wound like liquid fire. Draven hissed through his teeth, muscles tensing involuntarily against the pain. Celine's hand pressed against his uninjured shoulder, grounding him through the spike of agony. "Breathe through it. The pain means it's working." Silver leaves residue that normal healing can't address. This pulls it out, but the process isn't pleasant. Clearly, your bedside manner needs work. "I'm keeping you alive. Personality is extra." She applied more salve, methodical despite the way he flinched. "You're handling this better than most. I've treated hunters who scream through basic wound cleaning. You're just sitting there calculating whether the pain is worth the survival benefit." Is that a compliment? It's an observation. You've trained yourself not to react to physical suffering, probably a survival mechanism from years of combat and assassination attempts. She wrapped fresh bandages with practiced efficiency. "But pain exists for a reason, Draven. It tells you when something is wrong. Ignoring it completely turns you into something that can't distinguish between injury and normalcy." Philosophy from a blind Omega hiding in the wilderness. Wisdom from someone who's survived things that should have killed her. She secured the bandage, sitting back on her heels. "There. You should be able to move without bleeding everywhere now. The silver poisoning will take another day or two to fully clear your system, but you're past the critical danger point." "Thank you." The words felt foreign in his mouth. Gratitude was a luxury kings couldn't afford because it implied debt, obligation, weakness. But sitting in this abandoned lodge with a woman who had no reason to help him beyond basic decency, the formal distance of kingship felt absurd. Celine tilted her head, surprise flickering across her expression. "The Iron Wolf doesn't strike me as someone who thanks people often." "I don't." Which should tell you how rare this situation is. Being injured and dependent on a stranger. Being around someone who doesn't want anything from me. Draven leaned back against the wall, exhaustion pulling at him despite the sleep he'd already had. "Everyone in my life wants something. Power, position, access to resources, protection from enemies. Even loyalty is just another transaction where people calculate whether supporting me is more profitable than betraying me. And you think I don't want anything? I think you want to be left alone." Which is the first honest desire I've encountered in 9 years. Silence settled between them, not uncomfortable but heavy with things neither quite knew how to articulate. Outside, wind moved through the trees with a sound like distant voices. The fire crackled. Somewhere far away, a wolf howled territorial warnings that echoed across the mountains. Draven felt something shifting inside him, some fundamental recalibration he couldn't quite identify. Being here with Celine, away from the court and the crown and the constant performance of invincibility, reminded him of what he'd lost in pursuit of power. Connection. Trust. The ability to exist around another person without calculating threat assessments and political implications. Humanity. "Tell me about Varynth," Celine said quietly. "Not the conquest version, the real version. What's it actually like to rule an empire?" Draven considered the question, searching for truth beneath the propaganda he'd spent years constructing. Exhausting. Every decision carries consequences that ripple through thousands of lives. Every mistake gets people killed. Every moment of weakness invites challengers who see vulnerability as opportunity. You can't afford friends because friends become liabilities. Can't afford love because love makes you controllable. Can't afford trust because trust gets you poisoned during festivals. Sounds like prison. It is. Just a very expensive prison with good furniture and people who bow when you walk past. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 9 years settling on his shoulders. I unified the territories because they needed unity. Stopped centuries of territorial wars that killed thousands. Created trade routes, established laws, built infrastructure. By every objective measure, I've been a successful ruler. But I can't remember the last time I felt anything except strategic necessity. Can't remember what it's like to laugh without calculating whether showing emotion makes me look weak. Can't remember what it feels like to be around someone without wondering when they'll try to kill me. He opened his eyes, finding her pale gray gaze somehow fixed on him despite her blindness. I've spent 9 years becoming exactly what the kingdom needed, and somewhere along the way, I stopped being anything resembling human. Maybe that's the cost of power. Celine pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. You trade pieces of yourself until there's nothing left except the crown. And by the time you realize what you've lost, it's too late to get it back. Is that what happened to you? I never had power to trade. I just had survival. But yes, I've lost pieces too. Trust. Hope. The belief that people are fundamentally decent instead of fundamentally selfish. She smiled sadly. We're both damaged in different directions. You sacrificed humanity for strength. I sacrificed strength for humanity. Neither approach seems particularly effective. The observation settled between them like shared diagnosis. Two people broken by different circumstances, surviving through opposite strategies, ending up in the same abandoned lodge trying to figure out whether existence was worth the effort. What will you do when you recover? Celine asked. Return to Blackthorn Keep and execute everyone involved in the conspiracy? That's the logical choice. Draven studied the fire, watching flames consume wood with patient inevitability. Malric orchestrated both attempts. He needs to die publicly, brutally, as a warning to anyone else considering similar plans. Then I purge the court of everyone who supported him, restore order through overwhelming force, resume being the Iron Wolf everyone fears. You sound thrilled about the prospect. I sound tired, because that's what I am. Tired of endless cycles of betrayal and execution, tired of ruling through fear, tired of being alone at the top wondering if this is all there is. He met her gaze. But what's the alternative? Abandon the throne? Let the kingdom descend into chaos? All those people I unified would go back to killing each other within months. The infrastructure would collapse. The trade routes would fail. Everything I built would burn. So you're trapped by your own success. Trapped by responsibility. There's a difference. He shifted slightly, testing the limits of his injury. Power isn't just about personal benefit. It's about maintaining systems that millions depend on. The second I show weakness or hesitation, those systems start failing. People die. Not because I'm cruel, but because chaos is crueler than any tyrant. Celine was quiet for a long moment, processing his words with the same careful attention she'd shown treating his wounds. That's the loneliest thing I've ever heard. Being responsible for millions of lives while having no one who actually cares whether you live or die. Welcome to kingship. I think I'll pass, thanks. I can barely manage my own survival. Adding an empire sounds exhausting. Despite everything, the pain, the exhaustion, the grim certainty that returning to Blackthorn Keep meant resuming a performance he could barely sustain, Draven felt something unexpected. He almost laughed. The sound came out rough, damaged from disuse, but genuine in a way he couldn't remember experiencing in years. Celine's expression shifted to surprise, then something that looked almost like pleasure. Was that laughter? From the Iron Wolf himself? She smiled, real and unguarded. Should I be worried that you're having a mental breakdown? Probably. 9 years of paranoia and political maneuvering would drive anyone insane, and yet here you are, wounded, hunted, temporarily powerless. And you're laughing. Maybe losing control isn't the worst thing that could happen to you. The observation struck deeper than intended because it carried uncomfortable truth. Draven had spent 9 years maintaining absolute control, eliminating variables, reducing life to strategic calculations. And where had it gotten him? Poisoned by courtiers, hunted by hired killers, bleeding in an abandoned lodge while his kingdom probably celebrated his absence. Maybe control was just another prison he'd built for himself. They talked through the night, conversation wandering through subjects that had nothing to do with politics or survival strategy. Celine told him about growing up blind in a family that treated her disability like personal failure, about learning to navigate the world through sound and scent and touch, about developing abilities her sighted relatives never bothered cultivating because they relied on vision exclusively. I can sense emotions sometimes, she admitted, staring into the fire. Not clearly, not like reading thoughts, but people emit signatures. Fear smells sharp and acidic. Anger burns hot. Sadness feels heavy and cold. Most people think I'm strange when I mention it, so I learned to keep quiet. That's not strange. That's survival adaptation. Draven watched her profile, fascinated by the way firelight played across her features. You developed compensatory abilities because you had to. Most wolves would dismiss it as imagination or delusion. They're idiots who can't recognize capability when it doesn't match their expectations. Is that a compliment? It's respect. There's a difference. Celine turned toward him, those pale gray eyes somehow finding his despite not seeing. You're different here than your reputation suggests. The Iron Wolf is supposed to be emotionless, brutal, incapable of basic decency, but you've been almost human. Maybe I'm just too injured to maintain the performance. Or maybe the performance is what requires effort, and being human is what happens when you're too tired to pretend. She shifted closer, drawn by something neither of them could quite articulate. What are you afraid of, Draven? The question should have triggered automatic deflection. Kings didn't admit to fear. Fear was weakness, and weakness invited challengers. But sitting here in the firelight with someone who had no political agenda and nothing to gain from his vulnerability, the careful walls he'd constructed felt pointless. Becoming irrelevant, he said quietly. Spending 9 years building an empire only to discover I could be replaced by any ambitious alpha with sufficient ambition. That everything I've sacrificed, connection, trust, humanity itself, was meaningless because the kingdom doesn't actually need me. It just needs a crown. And crowns are interchangeable. Celine absorbed this, expression shifting through consideration to something that looked almost like sympathy. You're afraid of being disposable. That's why you can't tolerate betrayal. It's not about the threat to your life. It's about the confirmation that you're just a function to these people, not a person. The accuracy felt like surgical precision, cutting through layers of rationalization he'd constructed. Draven had spent years telling himself betrayal mattered because it represented strategic threat, political instability, challenges to legitimate authority. But beneath that lived the simpler, more devastating truth. Every act of disloyalty confirmed that he was alone, that despite commanding armies and ruling territories, despite 9 years of conquest and consolidation, no one actually gave a damn about Draven Kaelthorn the person. They cared about the crown. And the second he couldn't carry that crown effectively, they'd replace him without hesitation or regret. What are you afraid of? He asked, deflecting attention from truths he couldn't quite process. Celine pulled her knees to her chest, vulnerability making her seem smaller despite the strength he'd witnessed. Being found, being dragged back, being trapped in situations where I have no agency or control. She paused. But more than that, I'm afraid of accepting that survival is all there is, that escaping one prison just means finding new ones, that freedom is an illusion we tell ourselves to make the cages more bearable. You don't strike me as someone who accepts limitations easily. I don't. Which is why the fear is so paralyzing. She turned those blind eyes toward him again. If I accept that escape is impossible, that I'll always be running or hiding or surviving by the thinnest margins, then what's the point? Why keep fighting when the destination is just another version of the same suffering? Because fighting means you haven't surrendered. And surrender means they win. Who's they? The family who sold me? The nobleman who wanted to break me? The society that treats blind omegas like defective merchandise? She laughed bitterly. They've already won, Draven. I'm hiding in an abandoned lodge in the Forbidden Territories with no plan beyond surviving the next day. That's not victory. That's just slow-motion defeat with more privacy. Draven wanted to argue, wanted to construct some motivational rhetoric about resilience and perseverance. But sitting here injured and hunted, temporarily stripped of the crown that defined him, he couldn't summon the hypocrisy required for inspiration speeches. She was right. They were both just surviving, both running from different versions of the same fundamental problem, being trapped by circumstances they couldn't change and expectations they couldn't meet. The fire burned lower. Outside, the forest settled into the deep silence that preceded dawn. Somewhere in the distance, wolves howled communications that carried across the mountains like prayers to indifferent gods. You should sleep, Celine said softly. Your body needs rest to finish healing. The worst of the silver poisoning has passed, but you're still recovering from significant trauma. What about you? I'll keep watch. Old habit from years of living in situations where letting your guard down meant waking up dead or worse. She settled near the door, positioning herself where she could hear anyone approaching. Sleep, Draven. I'll wake you if anything threatens. He wanted to argue, wanted to maintain the appearance of strength and capability that kingship demanded. But exhaustion dragged at him with physical weight, and his wolf recognized safety in ways his conscious mind struggled to accept. For the first time in 9 years, Draven felt protected instead of being the one providing protection. The sensation was terrifying and comforting in equal measure. He slept. Draven woke to daylight filtering through cracks in the lodge walls and the smell of something cooking over the fire. His shoulder still ached, but the sharp agony of silver poisoning had faded to manageable discomfort. Healing was progressing, his shifter metabolism finally capable of repairing damage now that the contamination had been purged. Celine knelt by the fireplace, stirring something in the pot with the same efficient grace he'd witnessed the night before. She'd braided her hair, practical style that kept it away from her face. She looked tired but alert, the particular exhaustion of someone who'd spent the night on watch. "You didn't sleep," Draven said, sitting up carefully. She didn't turn around. "I don't sleep much. Nightmares make it pointless. I usually just rest for a few hours at a time, stay alert the rest. Safer that way." "Safer from what?" "We're 20 miles from the nearest settlement. Safer from memories. From the things that happen when you let your guard down." She ladled food into bowls, brought one over with the same casual competence as before. "Also, you talk in your sleep. Names I don't recognize, battles I wasn't part of. Someone named Kieran, who apparently betrayed you badly enough that you still dream about killing him 7 years later." Draven accepted the bowl, unsettled by how much she'd gleaned from his unconscious rambling. "You're observant. I'm a survivor. Observation is how I stay alive." She settled across from him, eating her own food with mechanical efficiency. "Who is Kieran?" "My best friend, military advisor, the person I trusted more than anyone in the kingdom. He tried to poison me during a celebration 7 years ago. Conspiracy involved dozens of people. I executed all of them." Draven stared at the food without tasting it. "That was the moment I learned trust was a liability I couldn't afford. And you've been alone ever since. I've been smart ever since. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Because from where I'm sitting, alone and smart look pretty similar." Celine finished her food, setting the bowl aside. "You've spent 7 years proving you don't need anyone. Congratulations, you succeeded. Now you're a king who has everything except anything that matters." The accusation stung because it was accurate. Draven had built an empire on the ashes of the relationships he'd burned, convinced himself that isolation was strength rather than just another kind of prison. "What would you suggest instead? Trust people who've already demonstrated they're untrustworthy? Open myself up to another Kieran situation and hope for better results?" "I'd suggest recognizing that not everyone is Kieran, that building walls high enough to keep out traitors also keeps out everyone else. That maybe, just maybe, the problem isn't that people are inherently untrustworthy. The problem is you've created a system where betrayal is the only rational response to your leadership." Draven felt his wolf rising, territorial and defensive. "You're saying the assassination attempts are my fault?" "I'm saying fear-based leadership creates environments where people conspire against you because they see no other option." She met his gaze despite not seeing him. "You've spent 9 years making sure everyone understands you're stronger, smarter, more dangerous than anyone else. Great. You've established dominance, but dominance without connection just makes you a target everyone wants to eliminate because you're threatening rather than valuable. So I should what exactly? Host friendship circles? Share feelings with courtiers who'd poison me the second I showed weakness? You should recognize the difference between strategic vulnerability and stupid vulnerability." Celine's voice sharpened. "Strategic vulnerability means building actual alliances with people who have reasons to keep you alive beyond fear. Stupid vulnerability means trusting everyone indiscriminately. You've chosen neither. You've chosen total isolation. And look where that's gotten you." The words hit like physical blows, each observation peeling away layers of rationalization he'd constructed. Draven wanted to argue, wanted to defend decisions he'd made for good strategic reasons. But sitting here injured and hunted, temporarily stripped of the crown that justified those decisions, he couldn't summon convincing counter-arguments. Maybe Celine was right. Maybe the problem wasn't betrayal itself, but the environment he'd created where betrayal was the only path people saw toward changing an untenable situation. "I don't know how to be anything except what I've become," he admitted quietly. "The Iron Wolf isn't just a reputation. It's survival mechanism, protective armor. The second I drop that performance, I become vulnerable in ways I can't afford. Then maybe you need to decide whether affording vulnerability matters less than continuing to exist in permanent isolation. She stood, moving toward the window with restless energy. You asked me earlier what I'm afraid of. I'll tell you what I'm not afraid of anymore. I'm not afraid of being vulnerable with the right person, because I've learned that some risks are worth taking even if they might destroy you. What changed? Meeting someone who saw me as human instead of damaged merchandise. Someone who didn't flinch from my blindness or treat me like I was fundamentally broken. She turned back toward him. You want to know the real difference between you and me, Draven? We've both been betrayed, but I'm still willing to risk connection. You've decided connection itself is the enemy. Before he could respond, sound erupted from the forest outside. Footsteps. Multiple people moving through undergrowth with the particular rhythm of trained soldiers. Voices calling coordinates in military shorthand. The distinctive clink of weapons and armor that suggested organized search patterns. They'd found him. Draven moved to the window, ignoring the protest from his healing shoulder. Through the trees, he spotted uniforms bearing Blackthorn Keep insignia. Royal Guards. At least a dozen, spreading out in coordinated search formation. Not assassins, his own soldiers, which meant either Rourke had sent them to locate their missing king, or Malric had sent them to finish what the mercenaries failed to accomplish. No way to determine which without direct confrontation. Get away from the window, Celine hissed, pulling him back. If they see you, they're my soldiers, technically, though whether they're loyal to me or to whoever's currently claiming power back at the keep is the interesting question. And if they're here to kill you, then I die fighting instead of hiding. Draven grabbed his weapons, testing his mobility. The shoulder was functional, if not optimal, good enough for combat if necessary. Better than being caught defenseless. That's your strategy? Fight a dozen trained soldiers while recovering from near-fatal injuries? Celine's voice carried exasperation and fear in equal measure. You're not invincible, Draven. You're just stubborn and temporarily suicidal. I'm a king who can't afford to be captured by unknown forces. There's a difference. The footsteps grew closer. Voices called coordinates. Someone shouted orders about checking the abandoned structures in the area. They'd reached the lodge within minutes. Draven positioned himself near the door, bow drawn, calculating angles of attack and defensive positions. If they were hostile, he'd take out as many as possible before they overwhelmed him. If they were loyal, he'd establish authority immediately and use them to return to Blackthorn Keep with sufficient protection. Either way, hiding was no longer an option. Celine grabbed his arm, fingers tight with urgency. If they find me here with you, what happens? Depends on whether they're trying to rescue me or kill me. That's not reassuring. Nothing about this situation is reassuring. Draven met her gaze, seeing fear and determination warring across her expression. Stay behind me. If they're hostile, run. Don't try to fight. Don't try to help. Just survive. And if they're loyal? Then we're about to have a very complicated conversation about why the Iron Wolf was hiding in the wilderness with a blind Omega while his kingdom descended into chaos. The footsteps stopped directly outside the lodge door. A voice called through the wood, familiar enough to trigger recognition. Your Majesty, if you're inside, Commander Rourke sent us to bring you home. Lord Malric has declared himself regent in your absence and is consolidating power. We're running out of time. Draven's wolf surged with territorial fury. Malric had moved faster than expected, seizing the opportunity created by the king's absence. Declaring regency was the first step toward claiming the throne outright. It meant trials, executions, purging everyone loyal to Draven under the pretense of restoring order. It meant war was already starting. He lowered the bow, opening the door to face a dozen soldiers who immediately dropped to one knee in synchronized deference. Their commander, a wolf named Garrett, who'd served since the early campaigns, looked up with relief and barely concealed urgency. My king. We've been searching for 3 days. The keep is in chaos. Malric has arrested half your inner council on conspiracy charges. Public executions are scheduled for tomorrow dawn. If we don't return immediately, there won't be a kingdom left to save. Draven processed the information with the cold efficiency of someone accustomed to crisis management. Malric was moving aggressively, using Draven's absence to eliminate opposition and establish himself as the legitimate authority. Classic coup tactics. Effective if executed quickly enough. How many soldiers remain loyal? Roughly half the garrison. The rest have either declared for Malric or are waiting to see who wins before committing. Garrett's expression darkened. He's offering gold and positions to anyone willing to swear allegiance, promising stability after what he's calling your reign of terror. Half the nobility is backing him. Of course they are. Fear is expensive to maintain. The second it looks like fear might not protect them anymore, people scramble for new allegiances. Draven glanced back at Selene, who stood frozen near the fireplace. We leave immediately. Full march speed back to Blackthorn Keep. My king. Garrett's gaze flickered toward Selene with barely concealed confusion. The woman is under my protection. That's all you need to know. Draven's voice dropped into command mode that ended discussion. Prepare the horses. We ride in 5 minutes. The soldiers departed to follow orders, leaving Draven alone with Selene in the sudden silence. She stood very still, arms wrapped around herself, expression carefully neutral in the way people used when processing information they didn't want to accept. You're leaving. I have to. If I don't return immediately, Malric executes everyone loyal to me and crowns himself king. The kingdom descends into civil war. Thousands die. Everything I built collapses. I know. Her voice was quiet, resigned. I know you have to go. She stopped, shaking her head. Never mind. It doesn't matter. Draven crossed the space between them, stopping close enough that he could smell winter flowers and smoke. What doesn't matter? I was starting to think maybe survival could mean something beyond just existing. That maybe connection was possible even for damaged people hiding from their past. She looked up at him with those pale gray eyes. But you have a kingdom to save. I have a life to survive. We were never going to be more than two people hiding in the same space for a few days. Come with me. The words emerged before conscious thought approved them. Draven heard himself say it and recognized the strategic insanity instantly. Bringing a blind Omega to Blackthorn Keep during a coup attempt was tactically absurd. She had no political value, no military capability, no reason to be anywhere near the violence about to erupt. But she also represented the first genuine human connection he'd experienced in 9 years. The first person who saw him as something beyond the crown. The first conversation that didn't feel like verbal combat disguised as diplomacy. And losing that felt worse than losing the throne. Selene stared at him like he'd suggested flying to the moon. That's insane. I'm a blind Omega with no combat training and a bounty on my head from a sadistic nobleman. I'd be a liability you can't afford during a military crisis. You'd be protected. No one touches you without going through me first. You're describing a prison with better security. I didn't escape one cage to walk voluntarily into another. It's not a cage. It's... Draven struggled to articulate something he barely understood himself. It's a choice. Stay here and survive alone. Or come with me and see if survival can mean something more than just not dying. Selene was silent for long enough that he thought she'd refuse. Then she spoke, voice quiet and terrified and determined. If I do this, if I go with you, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me you won't treat me like fragile property that needs protecting. Promise me you'll see me as a person capable of making decisions, even if those decisions are dangerous. Promise me this isn't just you collecting another possession to display your power. Draven cupped her face in his hands, feeling her flinch before leaning into the touch. I promise you're not a possession. You're the first real thing I've encountered in 9 years. The first person who reminded me what it feels like to be human instead of just functional. Then I'll come. She smiled, small and uncertain and brave. But if this turns out to be a mistake, I reserve the right to say I told you so before we both get killed. Fair enough. They left the lodge 5 minutes later, Selene mounted behind Draven on a horse that handled her weight easily. She pressed against his back, arms wrapped around his waist, trusting him to guide them through terrain she couldn't see. The soldiers maintained protective formation, weapons ready, hypervigilant for threats. They rode hard through the forbidden territories, putting distance between themselves and the temporary sanctuary that had sheltered a king and an Omega while the kingdom burned. Draven felt Selene's heartbeat against his back, rapid and nervous but steady. Felt her breathing adjust to the rhythm of the horse. Felt her hands tighten around him whenever the terrain got rough. And somewhere beneath the tactical calculations about returning to Blackthorn Keep, beneath the strategic planning for confronting Malric, beneath the grim certainty that violence was coming, Draven realized he'd just made the first genuinely emotional decision of his entire reign. Not because it was strategically optimal, but because losing her felt worse than dying, and that changed absolutely everything. They reached the outskirts of the capital as dusk painted the sky the color of old bruises. Blackthorn Keep rose against the horizon like a monument to ambition and violence, obsidian towers cutting into storm clouds that threatened rain. From this distance, the fortress looked exactly as Draven had left it, impenetrable, eternal, unchanged by the political chaos consuming it from within. But cities had tells if you knew how to read them. Torchlight patterns were wrong, concentrated in areas that should be dark. Guard rotations had shifted, soldiers positioned at checkpoints that didn't exist during normal operations. Smoke rose from the western quarter where executions were typically conducted, black plumes that suggested pyres still burning from recent killings. Malric was moving fast, consolidating power through violence and spectacle, the classic playbook for coups that couldn't afford gradual transitions. Execute the opposition, terrify the moderates, reward the opportunists, create facts on the ground faster than resistance could organize. Draven had used the same tactics himself during the unification campaigns. Watching them deployed against him carried the bitter satisfaction of being beaten with weapons he'd perfected. Commander Garrett rode close, voice low enough that only Alpha hearing could detect it. "My king, we have intelligence suggesting Malric has positioned forces at every entrance to the keep. He's expecting you to return. This could be a trap designed to capture or kill you the moment you appear." "Of course it's a trap." Draven kept his eyes on the fortress, calculating approach vectors and defensive positions. "Malric knows I can't ignore what he's doing. He's counting on my arrival to legitimize whatever theater he's prepared. Public confrontation, trial for abandoning the throne, execution framed as justice rather than murder. Then we don't walk into it. We gather loyal forces, coordinate with sympathetic nobles, build a proper military response instead of charging directly into, we don't have time for proper military responses." Draven cut him off. "Every hour I delay is another hour Malric uses to eliminate opposition and secure allegiances. Every execution he conducts makes reversing the coup harder. Speed is the only advantage I have left. Speed and suicide look similar from where I'm standing, Your Majesty." "Then it's fortunate I'm the one making strategic decisions." Draven felt Celine shift behind him, her arms tightening around his waist. "We approach directly. Main gate. Full visibility. I want every person in that fortress to see their king has returned." Garrett looked like he wanted to argue further, but recognized the futility. "My king, the woman. Her name is Celine, and she stays with me. With respect, bringing a civilian into a military confrontation is not your decision to question." Draven's voice dropped into the tone that ended discussions. "She's under my direct protection. Anyone who touches her answers to me personally. Is that clear?" "Crystal, Your Majesty." They rode toward the main gate in formation that communicated authority rather than aggression. Draven at the front, Celine pressed against his back. Loyal soldiers arrayed in protective configuration. Not an army, just a king returning home with his guard. The gates were closed, which was unusual for this hour. Normally, the main entrance remained open until full dark, allowing trade caravans and travelers to enter under supervision. Closed gates meant lockdown protocols, the kind implemented during emergencies or sieges. Draven guided his horse to within shouting distance, making sure his voice would carry to every soldier manning the walls. "I am King Draven Kaelthorn, rightful ruler of Varynth, returned from hunting to find my kingdom in chaos. Open the gates." Immediately. Silence answered him, heavy and deliberate. Soldiers lined the walls, weapons visible, faces carefully neutral. They'd been ordered not to respond, which meant Malric had anticipated this exact scenario and prepared instructions for handling it. Then a voice called down from the ramparts, familiar and unwelcome. Lord Malric Dustbane appeared at the wall's edge, dressed in ceremonial robes that suggested he'd already begun styling himself as regent, if not outright king. He looked down at Draven with expression carefully arranged into concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Draven, thank the gods you're alive. We feared the worst when you disappeared without explanation. The kingdom has been in turmoil." Malric's voice carried across the courtyard, pitched for the gathered soldiers and curious civilians starting to emerge from buildings. "We've had to make difficult decisions in your absence to maintain order and prevent total collapse. The performance was masterful. Malric playing the loyal servant forced into uncomfortable leadership, relieved by the king's return, but also subtly suggesting that return might be problematic. Every word calculated to plant doubt about Draven's legitimacy and his own necessity. Draven understood political theater at a level most wolves never reached. He'd spent 9 years orchestrating similar performances. The key to effective manipulation was making your agenda look like reluctant duty rather than naked ambition. I left to hunt conspirators who tried to poison me during the Harvest Moon gathering. Draven pitched his voice to carry across the entire courtyard. I needed to draw them into the open, identify who orchestrated the assassination attempt, and I succeeded. The traitor is you, Malric. You hired the mercenaries who attacked me in the Forbidden Territories. You orchestrated both attempts on my life. Malric's expression shifted through shock to sorrow with practiced ease. My king, I understand trauma can cause paranoia and delusions. You've been through terrible ordeals, but accusing me, your most loyal advisor, of conspiracy is precisely the kind of instability that forced the council to consider alternative leadership arrangements. The council you've been bribing and threatening into compliance. The council who watched you abandon the throne without explanation, leaving the kingdom vulnerable to enemies both foreign and domestic. Malric spread his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. We had to act. The alternative was chaos. Surely you understand that. I understand you've been planning this coup for months, waiting for the right opportunity to eliminate me and seize power. Draven felt his wolf rising, barely contained fury pushing against his control. The question is whether these soldiers are going to honor their oaths to their king, or whether they've already sold their loyalty to a traitor. The soldiers on the walls shifted uncomfortably. Some looked uncertain, caught between competing authorities. Others wore expressions of calculation, weighing which side offered better prospects. A few appeared genuinely conflicted, loyalty warring with pragmatism. This was the critical moment, the instant where power transferred or consolidated based purely on who could command immediate obedience. Draven had built his empire on the ability to project absolute authority, making resistance feel futile before it began. But 9 years of fear-based leadership meant those soldiers obeyed through intimidation rather than genuine allegiance. And intimidation only worked when you maintained the appearance of invincibility. Standing here demanding entry to his own fortress, temporarily displaced and visibly injured, Draven looked decidedly vincible. My king, Malric's voice softened with false sympathy. I think it's best if you enter the keep peacefully. Submit to a formal inquiry where we can examine these accusations in proper legal context. If you're innocent, and I truly hope you are, the truth will exonerate you. But charging and making wild claims will only make the situation worse. The trap was elegant. Frame cooperation as reasonable and resistance as evidence of guilt. Make Draven look unstable or tyrannical, regardless of his choice. Either he submitted to Malric's authority and legitimized the coup, or he attacked and confirmed he was the dangerous tyrant Malric had painted him as. Political chess at its finest. Draven was about to respond when Selene spoke quietly behind him, words meant only for his ears. He's already won the soldiers. You can hear it in how they're breathing, how they're positioned. They're not preparing to welcome their king. They're preparing to capture a threat. She was right. The tells were there if you knew how to read them. Weight distributed forward, ready to move, hands near weapons but not quite gripping them yet. The particular tension of people waiting for orders to attack. This wasn't a negotiation. It was theater preceding violence. Draven made his decision in the space between heartbeats. He dismounted, helping Selene down with deliberate care, making sure everyone could see him protecting her. Commander Garrett and the other soldiers formed a protective circle, loyal to the last but outnumbered 20-1 by the forces inside the keep. I'm entering my fortress, Draven called up to Malric. Not as a supplicant requesting permission, not as a subject submitting to inquiry, as the king reclaiming what belongs to him. Any soldier who interferes will be executed for treason once order is restored. Malric's expression shifted, false sympathy dropping away to reveal calculation beneath. I was hoping you'd be reasonable, Draven, but it appears 9 years of unchecked power has made you incapable of recognizing when you've been outmaneuvered. He raised his hand, signal prepared in advance. The gates opened, but instead of welcome, soldiers poured out in coordinated formation, weapons drawn, moving to surround Draven's small group with overwhelming force. 50 armed wolves, trained and equipped, operating under orders that became clear the moment their commander shouted instructions. Disarm them! Take the king into custody! Kill anyone who resists! Chaos erupted in the courtyard. Garrett and the loyal soldiers fought with desperate efficiency, trying to create space for Draven to maneuver. Steel clashed against steel. Wolves shifted into combat forms, primal and vicious. Blood sprayed across cobblestones as the first casualties fell. Draven shifted partially, enough to gain strength without losing the ability to use weapons. His wolf wanted full transformation, wanted to tear through the traitors with claws and teeth. But full shift meant losing strategic thinking, becoming pure instinct and rage. And rage was what Malric wanted. Rage made him look unstable, made the coup seem justified. He fought with controlled violence, dropping attackers with efficient brutality that came from decades of combat experience. A blade through one soldier's throat, claws across another's chest, movements economical and devastating. But they kept coming. For every wolf he killed, 2 more appeared. Malric had positioned overwhelming force specifically for this confrontation, ensuring Draven couldn't fight his way to victory. Commander Garrett fell with a crossbow bolt through his chest, dying with Draven's name on his lips. 2 other loyal soldiers died moments later, cut down by superior numbers. The rest were being forced back, fighting defensively, losing ground with each exchange. Draven felt Selene pressed against his back, protected by his body but trapped by the violence surrounding them. She was breathing fast, terrified but controlled, trusting him to keep her alive despite the increasingly obvious reality that survival was becoming unlikely. This is what defeat looked like. Not some glorious last stand, just mathematics. Too many enemies, too few allies, too much ground to defend. Malric appeared in his courtyard, walking through the carnage with the confidence of someone who'd already won. He wore a slight smile, satisfied with the execution of his plan. Yield, Draven. You've lost. Your supporters are dead or captured. Your authority is broken. The kingdom has moved on. Malric stopped just outside striking distance. Surrender now, submit to proper trial, and I'll ensure your death is quick. Continue this futility, and I'll make your execution a spectacle that haunts the kingdom for generations. Draven's wolf snarled inside his chest, demanding violence regardless of the tactical situation. Alpha instincts didn't understand surrender, didn't comprehend yielding, just recognized threats that needed eliminating. But the human part of him, the part that had spent 9 years making impossible strategic calculations, recognized the truth. He was beaten, not because he was weaker or less skilled, but because he'd created a system where fear was the only binding force, and fear evaporated the moment the feared lost the appearance of invincibility. These soldiers weren't betraying him out of malice. They were making the same calculation he'd taught them to make: identify the strongest force and align with it for survival. Malric was now the strongest force. Therefore, Malric deserved obedience. It was exactly how Draven had built his empire, and now it was destroying him. The bitter irony would have been funny if it wasn't so devastating. I'll yield, Draven said quietly, lowering his weapons, on one condition. You're not in a position to negotiate conditions. One condition, or I shift fully and kill as many of your soldiers as possible before you bring me down. Draven met Malric's gaze. You know what an alpha in full territorial rage can accomplish. You'll win eventually, but the cost will be high enough that your victory looks Pyrrhic. Hard to claim legitimate authority when you had to slaughter dozens to capture one wolf. Malric's eyes narrowed, calculating the risk against the benefit. What condition? The woman goes free, unharmed, unmolested. She leaves the city with safe passage and enough resources to survive wherever she chooses. You get me without excessive carnage. She gets her life. Everyone wins. Selene's fingers dug into his arm, voice tight with fear and fury. Don't you dare trade yourself for me. Don't you dare make me the reason you surrender. It's not surrender. Draven kept his voice calm despite the wolf howling inside him. It's ensuring you survive. That matters more than my pride. Your pride is the only thing keeping you alive. My pride is what got me into this situation. He turned slightly, wishing he could see her face properly, but grateful she couldn't see his. You were right earlier. I built an empire on fear and isolation. This is the inevitable result. But you're something real, something worth protecting. So I'm protecting you by dying. by making sure at least one good thing survives this disaster. Malric watched the exchange with expression shifting from calculation to something that looked like genuine curiosity. How touching. The Iron Wolf discovered feelings at precisely the moment it became his downfall. He stepped closer, studying Selene with interest that made Draven's protective instincts surge. Who is she, Draven? Why does a blind Omega matter enough that you'd trade your life for hers? Because she's the only person in 9 years who reminded me what it feels like to be human instead of just functional. How poetic. Malric smiled, cold and satisfied. Unfortunately, I don't accept your condition. The woman stays. Not as a hostage, exactly. More as insurance that you'll behave during the trial and execution. Threaten her safety, and you'll cooperate beautifully. It's the perfect leverage. Draven felt something snap inside his chest. The careful control he'd maintained throughout the confrontation shattered like glass under pressure. His wolf surged forward, transformation beginning before conscious thought could stop it. Malric had made a critical miscalculation. He'd threatened the one thing Draven cared about more than strategic advantage. And that changed everything. The shift happened faster than usual, fueled by rage and territorial fury that eclipsed rational thought. Massive black wolf, built for violence, operating on pure protective instinct. Draven's last human thought before the animal took over completely was grim acknowledgement that he was about to get everyone killed. But some things mattered more than survival. He tore through the soldiers surrounding them with primal efficiency. Claws ripped through armor. Teeth found throats with precision born from combat experience. Blood sprayed across stone. Wolves fell screaming. Malric backpedaled, shouting orders that struggled to be heard over the chaos. The soldiers tried to coordinate, tried to bring Draven down through superior numbers, but a fully shifted alpha in territorial rage was a force of nature that didn't respond to conventional tactics. Draven killed 7 wolves in the first 30 seconds. Then the crossbow bolts started hitting. Silver penetrated his flank. Another bolt tore through his shoulder, the same shoulder still healing from the previous assassination attempt. Pain exploded through his system, but the wolf didn't care about pain. The wolf cared about eliminating threats. More bolts. More silver burning through his body like acid. His movement slowed. Coordination degraded. The animal was strong, but biology had limits. Enough damage accumulated into the fatal regardless of willpower or protective instinct. He fell. Not dramatically, not in some heroic last stand, just collapsed sideways as his legs stopped supporting his weight. The cobblestones were cold against his fur. Blood pooled beneath him, spreading in dark patterns that looked black in the torchlight. Selene was screaming his name, hands reaching for him despite not being able to see where he'd fallen. Soldiers grabbed her, pulling her back, restraining her with the casual efficiency of people accustomed to handling hysterical civilians. Malric approached carefully, staying outside the range of Draven's teeth despite the obvious incapacitation. He looked down with expression mixing triumph and something that might have been genuine regret. You forced my hand, Draven. I wanted this to be civilized, a proper trial, legal transfer of power. But you couldn't even give me that dignity. His voice carried disappointment that felt authentic. 9 years ago, I admired you, watched you unify the territories through sheer force of will and tactical genius. I wanted to be you. Then I watched what the crown did to you, watched you hollow yourself out until nothing remained except paranoia and violence. And I realized the kingdom deserved better. Better being you, better being anyone who remembers that leadership requires more than fear. Malric gestured to his soldiers. Take him to the dungeons, medical treatment sufficient to keep him alive for trial tomorrow. The woman goes to the tower chambers. She's to be treated well, but kept under guard. She's leverage, not an enemy. Draven tried to move, tried to summon enough strength to shift back to human form and argue. But the silver poisoning was too advanced, the injuries too severe. His body was shutting down, conservation protocols engaging to prevent complete system failure. He watched through dimming vision as soldiers dragged Selene away, her screaming his name until distance swallowed the sound. Watched Malric give orders with the confidence of someone who'd already won. Watched his empire transfer ownership in real time, power flowing from one alpha to another through nothing more complex than superior positioning and better planning. The last thing Draven registered before unconsciousness claimed him was the bitter knowledge that he'd been right all along. Trust was a liability. Love was a weakness. Connection made you vulnerable in ways that got you destroyed. He'd learned that lesson 9 years ago with Kieran. Should have remembered it before making the same mistake with Celine. Should have stayed isolated and paranoid instead of opening himself to someone who became the perfect weapon against him. Some lessons required blood to teach properly. This one was going to cost him everything. Draven woke to pain and the smell of old stone. The dungeons beneath Blackthorn Keep had been designed for permanence rather than comfort. Cold walls that wept moisture. Iron bars reinforced with silver to prevent shifter escape. Chains specifically calibrated to restrain alphas without killing them outright. He'd commissioned the construction himself 6 years ago, never imagining he'd occupy the space as prisoner. His body felt like it had been disassembled and reassembled incorrectly. Silver still burned through his system, preventing natural healing. The crossbow wounds had been treated just enough to prevent death, but not enough to restore functionality. His shoulder was immobilized, ribs wrapped tight enough to make breathing and exercise in controlled agony. Someone had shifted him back to human form while he was unconscious. He was naked except for rough cloth wrapped around his waist, the final indignity of capture. Kings didn't get clothes. Prisoners did. How long? His voice came out rough, damaged from screaming during the shift and the violence that followed. A figure moved from the shadows near the cell entrance. Not a guard. Someone who'd been waiting for him to regain consciousness. Commander Rourke. Draven's heart surged with something between hope and suspicion. Rourke had been his most trusted officer, the one person he'd ordered to watch for traitors during his absence. Seeing him here could mean rescue was imminent. Or it could mean something infinitely worse. 12 hours, my king. Rourke's voice carried professional neutrality that revealed nothing about his allegiances. The trial begins at dawn. Malric has assembled the full council to witness your judgment. He's calling it justice for 9 years of tyranny. Draven searched his former commander's face for tells, for any indication of where his loyalty currently resided. Found nothing. Rourke had always been good at neutrality, the perfect military officer who followed orders regardless of personal feelings. Where do you stand in this? Where I've always stood, with the strongest force in the room. Rourke stepped closer to the bars, expression carefully neutral. You taught me that, my king. Loyalty is a transaction. People support whoever offers the best return on investment. Right now, that's Malric. The words landed like physical blows, each syllable confirming Draven's darkest suspicions about human nature and the futility of trust. Even Rourke, the soldier who'd served faithfully for 6 years, who'd survived 3 purges through demonstrated competence and apparent loyalty, even he had calculated that betrayal offered better prospects. You've been working with Malric how long? Since the first assassination attempt failed. Rourke showed no guilt, no shame, just matter-of-fact explanation. I was the one who told him you'd survived the poison. I was the one who coordinated with the mercenaries in the Forbidden Territories. I was the one who tracked your location and reported it back to Malric, so he could position forces for your return. Why? Because you created a system where betrayal was the only rational response to your leadership. Rourke's voice hardened. You ruled through fear and violence, eliminated everyone who questioned you, made loyalty synonymous with suicide because eventually you'd find a reason to suspect even your most faithful supporters. I watched you execute good soldiers over fabricated conspiracies, watched you purge entire families over imagined threats, and I realized the only way to survive was to position myself on the winning side before you decided I was disposable. So you made yourself disposable by becoming a traitor. I made myself invaluable by becoming the traitor who delivered you to Malric. There's a difference. Rourke smiled without warmth. He's offered me your position, commander of all military forces under the new regime. Gold, land, security for my family. Everything you could have offered if you'd been capable of actually valuing the people who served you. Draven wanted to argue, wanted to defend decisions he'd made for legitimate strategic reasons. But sitting here chained in his own dungeon, betrayed by the officer he'd trusted most after Kieran, the arguments felt hollow. Maybe Rourke was right. Maybe the problem wasn't that people were inherently disloyal. Maybe the problem was he'd built a system that made betrayal the only logical path toward security and advancement. Maybe this was exactly what he deserved. Where's Celine? The tower chambers. Malric is treating her well, as promised. She'll be used as leverage during your trial to ensure you don't do anything dramatic. Cooperate, and she survives. Resist, and she suffers. Simple equation. If he hurts her, you'll what? You're chained in a dungeon awaiting execution. You have no power, no authority, no ability to protect anyone, including yourself. Rourke's voice carried something that sounded almost like pity. This is what defeat looks like, Draven. Complete. Total. Irreversible. The empire you built is already moving on. Malric has begun implementing reforms, releasing political prisoners, offering clemency to families you destroyed, positioning himself as the merciful ruler who saved the kingdom from your tyranny. And the people are accepting it. The people are celebrating it. Turns out when you rule through fear, the second that fear disappears, everyone breathes easier. Rourke stepped back from the bars. I came to tell you this personally because I thought you deserved to know the truth. You're not being destroyed by some elaborate conspiracy or foreign enemies. You're being destroyed by the natural consequences of 9 years of brutality disguised as leadership. The words settled like lead in Draven's chest because they carried uncomfortable truth he couldn't dismiss. Everything happening now, the coup, the betrayals, the speed with which his empire was transferring loyalty to Malric, all of it was the logical outcome of decisions he'd made years ago. Rule through fear, and eventually someone will harness that fear against you. Trust no one, and no one will stand with you when the inevitable challenge arrives. Prioritize strength over connection, and discover that strength without foundation collapses the moment it's tested. He'd built his empire on sand and wondered why it was washing away in the first storm. What happens to Selene after the execution? Malric hasn't decided. She's politically useless but personally interesting. He might keep her as a curiosity, might release her, might sell her to someone who values blind omegas. Rourke shrugged. Honestly, her fate matters less than the symbolism of your death. Once you're gone, the kingdom can finally move forward. You mean, once I'm gone, Malric can consolidate power without legitimate challenge? Same thing, different phrasing. Rourke turned toward the exit. The trial begins at dawn, my king. I'd recommend cooperation. Malric is offering you the option of dignified execution if you confess to your crimes and validate his succession. Refuse, and he'll make the process significantly less pleasant. He left before Draven could respond, footsteps echoing through stone corridors that swallowed sound. Draven sat alone in the darkness, chains heavy on his wrists, body broken from silver and violence, empire collapsing in real time around him. For 9 years, he'd ruled Varynth through calculated brutality and absolute control. He'd eliminated threats, unified territories, built infrastructure and trade routes, created an empire that functioned with mechanical efficiency. And in the process, he'd made himself into something so isolated and feared that the second he showed vulnerability, the entire structure collapsed like a building with no foundation. Lady Blackwood had warned him. Selene had warned him. Even Malric had offered truth disguised as concern. But he'd been too consumed by maintaining power to recognize what he was sacrificing to keep it. Connection. Trust. The basic human bonds that made survival meaningful instead of just biological persistence. He'd traded all of that for a crown, and now the crown was being taken by someone who understood what Draven had apparently forgotten. Leadership required more than fear. It required people who believed your survival was connected to their own well-being. Malric had built that network, had positioned himself as the alternative to tyranny, had cultivated relationships while Draven cultivated paranoia. And when the moment came, those relationships proved stronger than any military force. Hours passed in silence, broken only by distant sounds of the fortress settling. Draven dozed fitfully, pain preventing real sleep. His wolf whined inside his consciousness, confused and hurt, instincts unable to process capture and imprisonment. Near dawn, footsteps approached again. Different rhythm, lighter weight. Someone moving with caution rather than authority. Selene appeared at the cell bars, guided by a guard who waited at respectful distance. She looked exhausted, bruised from being restrained during the courtyard violence, but alive and relatively unharmed. Her blind eyes found his location through some sense he didn't understand, tracking him despite not seeing. You're awake. Difficult to sleep when you're waiting for execution. Draven shifted slightly, chains rattling with the movement. Are you hurt? Bruises. Fear. Guilt for being the reason you surrendered. Otherwise fine. She pressed against the bars, hands reaching through to touch whatever she could find. Malric has been polite. Disturbingly polite, actually. Treating me like a guest instead of a hostage. Your leverage. Leverage gets treated well until it stops being useful. I hate that you taught me to think that way. To see manipulation in basic decency. To calculate ulterior motives instead of accepting kindness at face value. Celine's voice carried anger mixed with grief. You've infected me with your paranoia. Better paranoid than dead. Is it? Because from where I'm standing, paranoia just got you chained in a dungeon, awaiting execution while the empire you built celebrates your downfall. The accuracy stung worse because it came from her. From the one person who'd somehow seen past his reputation to whatever humanity remained buried beneath years of calculated violence. I'm sorry, he said quietly. For what? Surrendering to save me? Getting captured trying to protect me? Making me matter enough that I became a weapon against you? She laughed, bitter and broken. Or are you sorry for making me care about you? Because that's the real damage, Draven. I finally let myself care about someone, and now I get to watch them die for crimes I don't fully understand. The crimes are real. 9 years of brutality, executions, purges, ruling through fear instead of building anything sustainable. Malric isn't wrong about what I've done. He's just capitalizing on the inevitable consequences. So you're saying you deserve this? I'm saying this is what happens when you build empires on sand. Eventually, the foundation fails. Draven met her blind gaze, wishing she could see him properly for this. I don't regret protecting you. That's the only decision I've made in 9 years that felt human instead of strategic. But I regret dragging you into this. You deserve better than becoming collateral damage in political theater. Stop talking like you're already dead. The trial starts in an hour. Malric has the council, has the military, has popular support. I have chains and crossbow wounds. The mathematics aren't complicated. Mathematics don't account for the variables that matter. Celine's hands tightened on the bars. You're the most tactically brilliant alpha in the kingdom, the ruler who unified territories through strategic genius. You're telling me you can't find a way out of this? Not without getting you killed, and that's not an acceptable cost. Then we change what's acceptable. She pulled back slightly, expression shifting to determination that looked alien on features he'd mostly seen marked by resignation or fear. You taught me something during our time in that lodge. You taught me that survival sometimes requires doing things that feel impossible, taking risks that seem suicidal, betting everything on outcomes with terrible odds. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting you stop accepting defeat as inevitable and start thinking like the conqueror who built this empire. Celine's voice hardened. You've survived assassination attempts, military campaigns, political conspiracies that would have killed lesser alphas. You've built a kingdom from fractured territories. You've done impossible things through sheer force of will and tactical brilliance. Why are you surrendering now? Because I finally have something to lose that matters more than the empire. Then protect it. Not by accepting execution, by fighting back with every weapon you have left. Her blind eyes somehow found his. I didn't escape one prison to watch someone I care about walk voluntarily into another. So stop performing resignation and start planning survival. The guard shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncomfortable with how long this conversation was lasting. Time, miss. I was told 5 minutes. We're past that. Celine ignored him, attention focused entirely on Draven. Promise me you'll fight. Not suicidally, not dramatically, but actually fight with the same ruthless intelligence you've shown for 9 years. Promise me you won't make my survival the reason you give up. Draven wanted to promise, wanted to summon the tactical genius that had carried him through a dozen impossible situations. But sitting here broken and chained, watching his empire transfer ownership to someone who'd outmaneuvered him completely, the fight felt futile. Then Celine spoke again, voice dropping to whisper that somehow cut through his resignation. You told me in the lodge that some risks are worth taking even if they might destroy you. You said fighting means you haven't surrendered. That surrender means they win. She pressed her face against the bars. Don't surrender, Draven. Don't let them win. Not like this. The guard took her arm, pulling her gently but firmly away from the cell. Come on, miss. Trial's starting soon. You need to be positioned where Lord Malric specified. Celine allowed herself to be led away, but her words lingered in the cell like physical presence. Don't surrender. Don't let them win. Fight with the same ruthless intelligence that built the Empire. Draven sat alone in the darkness, chains heavy on his wrists, body broken from violence and silver. But something was shifting inside him. Some fundamental recalibration triggered by Celine's words and the specific way she delivered them. She was right. He'd built an empire through tactical genius and refusal to accept defeat. He'd survived situations that should have killed him by finding angles others missed and exploiting weaknesses others overlooked. He'd stopped fighting because he'd assumed protecting Celine required surrender. But maybe protection required something different. Maybe it required becoming the Iron Wolf one final time. Not the paranoid tyrant who ruled through fear, but the predator who eliminated threats with calculated precision. The trial would begin in less than an hour. Malric would orchestrate theater designed to legitimize his coup and delegitimize Draven's reign, would force confessions and perform justice as political spectacle, unless Draven disrupted the script. The chains were silver reinforced, designed to hold alphas even at full strength. But silver also had weaknesses, if you understood metallurgy and pressure points. The locks were sophisticated but followed predictable patterns. And Draven had spent 9 years studying every security system in Blackthorn Keep because paranoia meant preparing for scenarios where you might need to escape from your own fortress. He tested the chains carefully, mapping structural weak points, calculated the force required to exploit them, assessed his current physical condition against the energy expenditure needed. The mathematics were unfavorable, but not impossible. Everything came down to timing, precision, and willingness to accept pain as cost of survival. The same equation that had defined his entire reign. Draven closed his eyes, feeling his wolf stir beneath damaged flesh. The animal was wounded, but not broken. Exhausted, but not defeated. It recognized the scent of a fight worth having, even if the odds looked terminal. Malric thought he'd won, thought he'd captured the Iron Wolf and neutered the threat. But capturing a wolf and controlling it were very different things. And Draven Kaelthorn had spent 9 years proving that underestimating him was the last mistake enemies made. Dawn approached. The trial would begin. And by the time the sun fully rose, either Draven would be dead or Malric would learn why paranoid tyrants survived longer than merciful reformers. The choice was no longer about accepting fate. It was about determining whose blood would write the final chapter. The first lock broke at exactly the moment dawn light touched the eastern walls of Blackthorn Keep. Draven had been working the silver chains for 40 minutes, manipulating pressure points with controlled force that pushed his damaged body to its absolute limits. Each movement sent fire through his wounded shoulder. Each twist of his wrists opened partially healed wounds. Blood made the metal slippery, which actually helped because friction was the enemy when you were trying to exploit structural weaknesses in restraint systems. The truth about imprisonment that most people never learned was this: locks were only as strong as their weakest component. Silver-reinforced chains were designed to hold shifters at full strength, but they relied on uniform material integrity. Create a single point of failure, and the entire system became compromised. Draven had learned that lesson during the territorial wars when he'd been captured by enemy forces and left chained in a burning building. He'd escaped through a combination of leverage physics and willingness to dislocate both shoulders to slip the restraints. The building had collapsed minutes after he got out, burying 3 enemy soldiers who'd been celebrating his imminent death. Pain was temporary. Death was permanent. Everything else was just mathematics. The second lock took 8 more minutes. By the time both chains fell away, Draven's wrists were raw meat, blood dripping onto stone floors that had probably witnessed 1,000 similar struggles. His body screamed protest at the abuse, silver poisoning making every movement feel like pushing through deep water. But he was free. Free and naked except for cloth wrappings. Free and wounded badly enough that walking required conscious effort. Free and alone in a dungeon beneath a fortress controlled by enemies. The odds were catastrophically bad, which meant they were exactly where Draven did his best work. He moved to the cell door, studying the lock mechanism with the focus of someone whose survival depended on understanding complex systems. Guard rotations would change soon. The trial was scheduled to begin within the hour, which meant Malric would send soldiers to retrieve him any minute. Draven had maybe 10 minutes before this window closed permanently. The lock was sophisticated but followed standard keep security protocols he'd designed himself 6 years ago during a security overhaul. He knew the weak points because he'd specifically instructed the engineers where to place them. Paranoid planning for scenarios where he might need to escape from inside his own fortress. Paranoia that was finally paying dividends. He used a sliver of broken chain as an improvised pick, manipulating the tumblers with the delicate precision of someone performing surgery. Metal scraped against metal. The sound felt deafening in the silence, every noise potentially alerting guards stationed throughout the dungeon level. The lock clicked open. Draven eased into the corridor, every sense hyper-alert for threats. The dungeons were designed as a maze, deliberately confusing to prevent escaped prisoners from finding exits quickly. But he'd memorized the layout years ago, the same way he'd memorized every critical system in Blackthorn Keep. Trust no one. Prepare for everything. Assume betrayal was inevitable and plan accordingly. Those principles had made him paranoid and isolated. They'd also kept him alive through a dozen situations that should have ended fatally. 2 guards were stationed at the intersection ahead, playing dice on an overturned barrel, bored by routine that assumed their prisoner was securely contained. They were competent soldiers, but not exceptional, the kind who followed orders adequately without displaying the initiative that earned promotions. Draven evaluated approach vectors. Direct confrontation risked noise that would alert other guards. Stealth required getting close enough to neutralize both before either could raise alarm. His current physical condition made that challenging, but not impossible. The human body had specific vulnerabilities that remained consistent regardless of shifter genetics. Carotid arteries, trachea, nerve clusters that caused instant unconsciousness when struck correctly. Draven had spent decades perfecting techniques for incapacitating opponents quickly and quietly. He moved through shadow like smoke given predatory intent. The first guard died without sound, neck snapped with precision that came from muscle memory rather than conscious thought. The second guard had time to register surprise before Draven's hand crushed his windpipe, cutting off the scream before it formed. Both bodies dropped. Draven caught them, lowered them gently to prevent noise, stripped one of weapons and clothing that mostly fit despite the size difference. The uniform was loose but functional, good enough to pass casual inspection in dim lighting. He armed himself with knives, a short sword, and the guard's access keys. Moved deeper into the dungeon complex, navigating toward the stairwell that connected to the main fortress levels. Every step required conscious effort. Silver poisoning made his body respond sluggishly, healing compromised to the point where normal shifter regeneration wasn't functioning. He was operating on pure tactical calculation and the kind of stubborn refusal to quit that had defined his entire reign. The stairwell guard was more alert, positioned where he could see anyone approaching from multiple directions. Draven couldn't rely on stealth here. He'd have to use misdirection. He stepped into view, allowing the guard to see the stolen uniform and the confident posture that suggested legitimate authority. Moved forward like he belonged there, like he was supposed to be accessing the upper levels. The guard's hand moved toward his weapon, instincts sensing something wrong even if conscious thought hadn't caught up yet. Draven killed him before the hand reached the blade. Quick thrust through the heart, angled upward to pierce vital organs. The guard's eyes went wide with shock and recognition, realizing too late that he'd been fooled by appearance and confidence. Understanding the psychology of authority was more valuable than any weapon. People saw what they expected to see. Wear the uniform, project confidence, move like you have permission, and most guards would hesitate just long enough for you to kill them. Draven had built an empire on understanding those psychological vulnerabilities. Had spent 9 years exploiting the gap between appearance and reality. Had perfected the art of making people see the projection instead of the truth beneath it. Now he was using those same techniques to dismantle the coup that threatened to end him. He climbed the stairwell, each step sending shockwaves of pain through his damaged body. The silver poisoning was getting worse, not better. His vision blurred occasionally, dark spots appearing at the edges. His hands trembled despite efforts to control them. Biology had limits. He was approaching his rapidly. The question was whether he'd reach Malric before those limits shut him down completely. The upper levels of Blackthorn Keep were stirring with pre-trial activity. Servants rushed through corridors preparing the grand hall for the spectacle Malric had orchestrated. Guards took positions at strategic points, securing the fortress against potential disruption. Nobles gathered in clusters, dressed in formal attire, anticipating the political theater about to unfold. Everyone focused on the trial. No one expecting the prisoner to be loose and armed, moving through their midst wearing a dead guard's uniform. Draven navigated toward the tower chambers where Selene was being held. He needed her safe before confronting Malric, needed to eliminate the leverage that made him controllable, needed to ensure that whatever happened next, she'd survive. The tower stairs were guarded by 2 soldiers who looked more alert than the dungeon personnel. They straightened as Draven approached, hands moving toward weapons with the unconscious efficiency of trained professionals. "Lord Malric sent me to escort the prisoner to the trial," Draven said, voice flat and authoritative. "The woman needs to be positioned in the gallery before proceedings begin." The guards exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering across their expressions. Standard protocol was that Malric's personal guard handled prisoner transfers. Random soldiers showing up with new orders triggered suspicion. "Let me see your authorization," one guard said, hand still on his weapon hilt. Draven moved before the sentence finished. The first guard died with a blade through his throat, blood spraying across white stone walls. The second managed to draw his sword, managed to parry Draven's initial strike, managed to shout warning before Draven's knife found the gap between his ribs and pierced his heart. The shout echoed through the tower stairwell, alarm that would bring reinforcements within seconds. Draven's window of opportunity was collapsing. He had maybe 2 minutes before soldiers converged on this position, 2 minutes to reach Selene, secure her safety, and escape before overwhelming force made survival impossible. He burst through the tower chamber door, finding Selene sitting near the window, head turning toward the sound of his entrance. She was dressed in formal clothing, expensive fabric that suggested Malric had been keeping his promise about treating her well. "Draven!" Her voice carried disbelief and hope in equal measure. "How?" "No time. We need to move. Now!" He crossed the room, taking her arm with urgency that communicated the crisis without requiring explanation. "You're hurt. I can smell blood. You shouldn't be moving at all, let alone I'm dying slowly from silver poisoning, which means I need to finish this before biology makes the decision permanent." He guided her toward the door, hyper-aware of footsteps already thundering up the tower stairs. "We have seconds before soldiers arrive in force. I need you to trust me completely. Can you do that?" Selene nodded, fear and determination warring across her expression. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere Malric won't expect. Somewhere we can leverage the only advantages I have left." He pulled her into the corridor, moving away from the main stairwell toward the secondary access points he'd built into the tower during the original construction. Every fortress had hidden passages designed for emergency evacuation. Draven had commissioned 3 separate systems throughout Blackthorn Keep, paranoid preparation for scenarios where visible exits became compromised. Malric knew about 2 of them because they were documented in official records. The third existed only in Draven's memory and the sealed construction documents he'd personally destroyed after completion. He triggered the hidden door through a sequence of pressure points disguised as decorative stonework. The wall section swung inward, revealing a narrow passage that descended through the tower's interior structure. Dark, cramped, and utterly invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. "Where does this go?" Selene asked as Draven pulled her into the passage. "The Grand Hall. There's an observer's alcove built into the upper gallery, designed so rulers could watch trials and council meetings without being visible to participants. We're going to watch Malric's performance from the one place he won't think to guard." "That's insane. You should be escaping, not walking into the exact location where every soldier in the keep will be gathered. Escaping means leaving Malric in control, means accepting that he's won, means spending the rest of my life hiding while he consolidates power and rewrites history to paint me as the tyrant who deserved removal." Draven navigated the narrow passage, one hand on the wall for guidance, the other keeping Selene close. "I didn't build this empire to watch it get stolen by someone who thinks mercy is a sustainable leadership strategy. So what's the plan? Interrupt the trial? Make some dramatic appearance and demand your throne back? The plan is to remind everyone in that hall why they feared me in the first place." Draven's voice dropped into something cold and final. "Fear is only effective if people believe you're still dangerous. Malric has been positioning me as defeated, broken, no longer a threat. I'm going to demonstrate how wrong that assessment is." "By doing what, exactly?" "By killing him in front of the entire court. Publicly. Brutally. In a way that makes every ambitious wolf in the kingdom recalculate whether challenging me is worth the potential cost." Selene was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. That's not leadership, that's terrorism. Leadership and terrorism are different words for the same thing depending on who's defining terms. Draven reached the passage end, finding the concealed door that opened into the observer's alcove. Right now, I don't have the luxury of philosophical debates about methodology. I have biology shutting down, a coup in progress, and approximately 20 minutes before the silver poisoning kills me, regardless of tactical advantage. So I'm using what time I have left to send a message. What message? That the Iron Wolf doesn't die quietly. The observer's alcove was exactly as Draven remembered, a small space built into the upper gallery with sightlines covering the entire grand hall, but concealed behind decorative latticework that made observation one-directional. He positioned Selene in the corner farthest from the entrance, somewhere she'd be protected if violence erupted. Below them, the grand hall was filling with nobles, military officers, and council members summoned to witness the trial. Malric had orchestrated impressive theater, transforming the space into a courtroom with the throne positioned as judgment seat. Guards lined every wall, weapons visible, projecting authority and control. The entire spectacle designed to demonstrate that power had transferred completely from Draven to Malric. That the old regime was finished and a new era of enlightened leadership was beginning. Draven watched from the shadows, cataloging defensive positions and calculating attack vectors. The odds were terrible. Malric had positioned overwhelming force throughout the hall. Even if Draven managed to kill him, the subsequent response would be lethal. But some victories weren't about survival. Some victories were about ensuring your enemies never forgot the cost of challenging you. The price of power that textbooks never mentioned was this. Sometimes maintaining authority required destroying yourself in the process. Required demonstrating that you were willing to burn everything down rather than allow enemies to claim what you built. Required being so terrifying in defeat that future challengers thought twice before attempting similar coups. Draven had spent 9 years building that reputation. Now he needed to cash it in for one final demonstration. Malric entered the grand hall wearing ceremonial robes that suggested he'd already crowned himself in everything but name. He moved with the confidence of someone who believed victory was complete, whose careful planning had succeeded beyond expectations. He took position at the throne, Draven's throne, settling into the seat with the casual ownership of a wolf claiming new territory. The symbolism was deliberate and devastating. Malric wasn't just executing a political rival, he was erasing Draven's entire legacy in real time. "Bring forth the prisoner," Malric commanded, voice carrying across the hall with practiced authority. Guards moved toward the corridor connecting to the dungeons, preparing to retrieve a prisoner who wasn't there. Confusion would erupt any second when they discovered the empty cell and dead guards. Malric's carefully orchestrated performance would descend into chaos. That was the moment Draven needed to exploit. "He's not in the dungeons," Draven called down from the alcove, voice cutting through the gathering like a blade. "Because unlike you, Malric, I don't accept defeat just because the odds look unfavorable." Every head turned upward. Shock rippled through the assembled crowd like electricity. Malric's expression shifted from confidence to disbelief to calculation in the space of heartbeats. Draven stepped forward where everyone could see him, still wearing the stolen guard uniform, blood visible on his hands and face. He looked exactly like what he was, a wounded predator pushed beyond limits, operating on fury and stubbornness rather than any rational survival instinct. "How?" Malric's voice faltered before reasserting control. "Secure him. Every guard in this hall converge on that alcove immediately." Guards moved to obey, but Draven was already speaking, voice amplified by the acoustic design of the grand hall. "Everyone in this room needs to understand something. Malric sold you a story about merciful reform, about enlightened leadership replacing brutal tyranny, about a new era of justice and compassion." He paused, letting the words settle. "He's lying. Not about what I was. I ruled through fear and violence. That's accurate. But Malric isn't offering you something better. He's offering you something weaker. And weakness gets kingdoms destroyed. That's exactly the kind of rhetoric that justified your reign of terror." Malric shot back, recovering his composure. "You're proving my point, Draven. You can't conceive of leadership that doesn't revolve around intimidation and brutality. I'm proving that empires survive through strength, not good intentions." Draven moved along the alcove edge, staying mobile as guards converged on his position. You've spent weeks positioning yourself as the compassionate alternative, releasing prisoners, offering clemency, promising reforms. And you know what that actually does? It signals weakness. It tells every ambitious alpha in neighboring territories that Varynth is vulnerable, that the new regime values mercy over security, that now is the perfect time to test our borders and see if the kingdom can actually defend itself without the Iron Wolf protecting it. The crowd stirred, nobles exchanging uncertain glances. Draven was speaking to their deepest fears, the anxieties that kept rulers awake despite successful coups. Malric had positioned himself as the civilized alternative, but civilization required military strength to sustain it, and military strength required the kind of ruthless decisiveness that Malric had been explicitly campaigning against. "You're fear-mongering," Malric said, but his voice carried less certainty now. "Trying to make people believe only tyranny can keep them safe. I'm stating facts." Draven locked eyes with him across the hall. 9 years ago, this kingdom was fractured territories constantly at war. I unified it through force. I established order through violence. I created trade routes by eliminating anyone who threatened them. Was it brutal? Yes. Was it necessary? Ask anyone who remembers what life was like before the unification. Ask farmers whose fields aren't burned every harvest season. Ask merchants whose caravans aren't raided by territorial warlords. Ask families who don't lose children to pointless wars anymore. The hall had gone completely silent. Every person present was calculating, weighing Draven's words against Malric's promises, trying to determine which version of leadership offered better prospects for survival and prosperity. This was the moment that decided everything, not through violence, through rhetoric and reputation, and the fundamental question every ruler eventually faced: what mattered more, being loved or being effective? Malric stood, commanding attention back to himself. "You're right that you unified the territories. You're right that you brought order, but you're wrong that brutality was the only path toward those outcomes. You chose fear because that's who you are, not because it was necessary, but because you're incapable of building anything that doesn't require violence as its foundation. Then prove me wrong." Draven's voice dropped into challenge that reverberated through the hall. "Maintain order without fear. Defend borders without ruthless violence. Build alliances without the underlying threat of military retaliation if terms aren't met. Do all of that, and I'll admit I was wrong about everything." Malric opened his mouth to respond, but Draven wasn't finished. "But when you fail, and you will fail because compassion is expensive and kingdoms operate on brutal economics, remember that I warned you. Remember that every soldier who dies because you hesitated to use overwhelming force paid the price for your moral superiority. Remember that every territory you lose because enemies perceived weakness paid the cost of your enlightened leadership. And remember that the person who tried to tell you this truth was the tyrant you executed for being too brutal to tolerate." The words hung in the air like smoke in an enclosed space. Draven could see the impact rippling through the crowd, nobles and military officers recalculating their positions. Malric had won the coup through superior positioning and political maneuvering, but Draven was winning this moment through the same ruthless clarity that had built the empire. The truth about power that most people never learned was this: fear lasted longer than love. Fear survived transitions of authority. Fear influenced decisions years after the person who inspired it was gone. Building a legacy on fear meant that even in defeat, even facing execution, you could still shape outcomes through the reputation you'd constructed. Malric had killed the king, but he hadn't killed what the king represented. Guards reached the alcove entrance, weapons drawn, preparing to storm the position. Draven had seconds before they overwhelmed him through sheer numbers. He turned to Selene, who'd been silent throughout the exchange, listening to words that revealed exactly who Draven Kaelthorn actually was beneath the brief humanity he'd shown in the lodge. "I'm sorry you had to hear that. I'm sorry you had to see what I become when the crown is at stake." Selene reached out, finding his face with her hands despite not seeing him. "Don't apologize for being exactly who you told me you were. You warned me this was who you are. I chose to come anyway. Then I need you to forgive me for what happens next, because I'm about to do something that can't be undone." Before she could respond, Draven moved. He didn't attack the guards converging on the alcove, didn't try to fight his way through overwhelming numbers. Instead, he vaulted over the alcove railing, dropping 20 feet to the Grand Hall floor below. The fall should have broken bones, should have incapacitated him completely given his already compromised physical condition. But Draven shifted mid-descent, partial transformation absorbing the impact through muscle and bone structure designed for violence. He landed in full wolf form, massive and black and radiating the kind of primal menace that made civilized people remember they were prey animals wearing expensive clothes. The crowd scattered, nobles fled screaming toward exits. Military officers drew weapons, forming defensive positions. Guards poured into the hall from every entrance, converging on the threat with coordinated efficiency. And at the center of the chaos, Malric stood frozen at the throne, calculating whether to run or fight, whether survival or pride mattered more in this instant. Draven gave him exactly 1 second to make that decision. Then he charged. The distance between them was 50 feet. Draven covered it in 3 bounds, moving with speed that shocked everyone watching. Guards tried to intercept, tried to position themselves as barriers between predator and target. Draven tore through them like they were paper, claws ripping through armor and flesh with equal efficiency. Blood sprayed across marble floors. Soldiers fell screaming. The Grand Hall descended into carnage that would be recounted in whispered stories for generations. Malric shifted at the last possible second, meeting Draven in wolf form rather than allowing himself to be torn apart as a human. They collided with impact that shook the throne platform, 2 alphas at full territorial rage, fighting for dominance and survival. The battle was savage and brief. Malric was younger, healthier, uninjured, but Draven had spent 9 years fighting threats that would have killed weaker wolves, had perfected violence into an art form that transcended mere physical advantage, had become something so completely optimized for combat that even dying and outnumbered, he was the most dangerous creature in the hall. He broke Malric's jaw with the first strike, tore his shoulder open with the second, went for the throat on the third, teeth finding the vulnerable spot beneath the fur where arteries pulsed with life. Malric thrashed, desperate and terrified, recognizing too late that he'd miscalculated everything. He'd thought capturing Draven meant defeating him, thought chains and trials and overwhelming force would be sufficient to end the threat. He'd forgotten that some wolves only became truly dangerous when you cornered them. Draven's teeth closed around his throat. Blood filled his mouth, hot and copper-tasting and satisfying at a level deeper than conscious thought. His wolf was howling victory, claiming dominance, establishing that no challenge would be tolerated. He could end it, could crush Malric's windpipe and watch him die, eliminating the threat permanently. Should end it, because leaving him alive meant risking everything he'd fought for in this insane last stand. But then Celine's voice cut through the chaos, calling his name from the alcove above. Not screaming, not panicked, just speaking his name with the particular tone of someone trying to reach him before he crossed a line he couldn't return from. Draven. Just his name. Nothing else. But it was enough. He released Malric's throat, stepping back from the killing blow. Let the other alpha collapse, wounded and broken, but alive. Shifted back to human form, standing naked and blood-soaked in the center of the Grand Hall, while guards surrounded him with weapons drawn. Silence crashed across the space like physical weight. Every person present was frozen, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. The dead king wasn't dead. The defeated tyrant wasn't defeated. The trial designed to legitimize a coup had become a demonstration of exactly why challenging Draven Kaelthorn was a potentially fatal miscalculation. Draven turned to face the assembled crowd, blood dripping from his hands, body swaying from exhaustion and silver poisoning, and injuries that should have killed him hours ago. I could have killed him! His voice carried across the hall despite the damage to his body. I could have torn his throat out and reclaimed my throne through pure violence. That's what you expected, isn't it? That's what the Iron Wolf would do. He moved toward the throne, each step visible, effort, each breath labored. But she asked me not to. One woman, blind and powerless by every metric this kingdom values, asked me to be better than my worst instincts. And that mattered more than the crown, more than the empire, more than maintaining dominance through fear. He reached the throne, looked at it like it was a poisonous artifact that had cost him everything. So here's what happens now. Malric lives. He receives medical treatment and clemency I don't deserve to offer, but am offering anyway. The coup is over, not because I defeated it through superior violence, but because I'm choosing differently than you expect. "What are you saying?" someone called from the crowd, voice trembling with confusion and residual fear. "I'm saying the Iron Wolf is finished." Draven met Celine's gaze across the distance separating them, seeing her pale gray eyes somehow finding his position. "This empire needs something different than what I built. Something that doesn't require constant fear and violence to maintain. Something that might actually be sustainable instead of just effective." Malric was wrong about a lot of things, but he was right that my approach was destroying me along with everyone around me. He turned back to the crowd, seeing calculation and uncertainty warring across hundreds of faces. "So I'm abdicating. Effective immediately. The throne passes to whoever the council decides can actually lead this kingdom towards something resembling civilization instead of organized brutality. I'm done." The words felt like cutting away pieces of himself, carving out the identity he'd built over 9 years and leaving it bleeding on the marble floor. The crown had defined him so completely that walking away felt like voluntary death. But maybe that was the point. Maybe real change required dying to who you were and becoming something entirely different. The crowd erupted into chaos. Questions shouted from every direction. Nobles arguing about succession. Military officers demanding clarity about chain of command. The entire structure of authority collapsing in real time. And through it all, Draven moved toward the alcove stairs, climbing toward Celine with the last reserves of strength his body could summon. Guards didn't stop him. No one tried to intervene. They were all too shocked by what they'd witnessed to process appropriate responses. He reached Celine as his body finally gave out completely, collapsed against her, feeling her arms wrap around him despite the blood and the wounds and the absolute disaster he'd made of everything. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the stupidest," she said quietly, holding him upright through sheer determination. "I haven't decided which. Can it be both? Probably." She adjusted her grip, supporting more of his weight as consciousness started slipping away. "You're dying, aren't you? I can feel your heartbeat getting irregular, feel your body temperature dropping, silver poisoning, internal injuries, exhaustion, blood loss. Take your pick." Draven's vision was graying at the edges, darkness closing in with the inevitability of biology asserting final authority. But I kept my promise. I fought. I didn't surrender. I just changed what winning looks like. "Is this winning? You just gave up your empire. I gave up a crown that was killing me." "There's a difference." He felt his legs failing, weight becoming too much for Celine to support alone. "Help me outside. I want to see the sunrise one more time before this ends. You're not dying. I won't let you." "That's sweet, but biology doesn't negotiate." Celine pulled him toward the corridor, muscle memory guiding her through the fortress she'd only experienced for days. Behind them, the Grand Hall continued its descent into chaos, power vacuum creating the exact instability Draven had spent 9 years preventing. But that was someone else's problem now. His only concern was making it outside, feeling sunlight one final time, dying as something resembling human instead of the monster he'd become. They reached the eastern balcony as dawn painted the sky shades of gold and crimson. Draven collapsed against the stone railing, body finally refusing to function anymore. Silver poisoning had progressed beyond critical stages. His heart was struggling to maintain rhythm. His breathing came in ragged gasps that suggested minutes rather than hours remaining. Celine knelt beside him, hands finding his face, tears streaming down her own despite her inability to see what she was losing. "Stay with me, please. I can't. I just found you. You can't leave now. Death doesn't care about timing." Draven managed to smile despite the pain consuming him. "But thank you. For reminding me what it felt like to be human. For showing me there was more to existence than strategy and survival. For mattering enough that dying feels like an actual loss instead of just biological cessation." "Stop talking like you're already gone." "I'm already gone, Celine. The only question is whether I leave behind anything except cautionary tales about power and isolation. You leave behind someone who loved you despite knowing exactly what you were." Her voice broke on the words. "Someone who saw the monster and the man and chose both. Someone who will remember you as more than the Iron Wolf. That's more than I deserve. Probably. But you get it anyway." Draven's vision was fading completely now, darkness claiming everything except the warmth of Celine's hands on his face and the distant sound of sunrise birds greeting the new day. His wolf was quiet finally, No longer fighting, no longer demanding dominance or territory or victory, just accepting the inevitable with something approaching peace. His last conscious thought was the recognition that he'd spent 9 years building an empire that would forget him within a generation. But maybe one person remembering him as human was worth more than 1,000 who remembered him as the tyrant. Maybe that was the real victory after all. Then darkness swallowed him completely, and Draven Kaelthorn, the Iron Wolf, the Alpha King who unified Varynth through blood and calculated violence, ceased to exist. Or so it appeared to everyone watching. But in the shadows beyond the balcony, where ancient magic still breathed through cracks in the world, something stirred. Something that recognized Celine's bloodline and the particular curse that ran through her veins. Something that had been waiting for exactly this moment. The moment when an alpha strong enough to channel it finally released his grip on life while connected to an omega whose gifts transcended anything the kingdom understood. Death was negotiable if you knew which forces to bargain with. And bargaining required a cost neither Draven nor Celine had agreed to pay. Yet, death tasted like copper and regret. Draven floated in darkness that felt less like absence and more like waiting, consciousness suspended in the space between heartbeats that no longer came. He could hear Celine crying above him, her voice distant and distorted like sound traveling through deep water. Could feel her hands on his face, warm against skin that was rapidly cooling toward ambient temperature. Biology had won. Silver poisoning and blood loss and injuries accumulated across a lifetime of violence had finally exceeded what even an alpha's body could endure. His heart had stopped. His lungs no longer drew breath. The electrical signals that animated flesh had ceased firing. By every medical standard that mattered, Draven Kaelthorn was dead. But consciousness remained, which violated everything he understood about mortality and the clean finality of biological cessation. Death was supposed to be simple. You stopped functioning and awareness ended. No afterlife. No continuation. Just the universe reclaiming atoms for other purposes. This felt like something else entirely. Through the darkness, sensation began filtering back in fragments. Not physical sensation exactly, but awareness of presence. Something ancient watching him with interest that predated language or civilization. Something that had been sleeping in the foundations of the world, waiting for specific conditions to align. An alpha at the threshold of death. An omega with cursed bloodline capable of channeling forces most wolves had forgotten existed. Connection forged between them, strong enough to create pathways through the boundaries separating life from whatever came after. Magic was supposed to be legend, folktales told by old wolves who remembered when the world operated on different physics. The unification campaigns had systematically eliminated practitioners, destroyed texts, erased institutional knowledge until magic became myth. But myths didn't care about political purges. They waited in forgotten places until the right combination of desperation and power gave them permission to resurface. Draven felt the presence coalescing into something approaching consciousness, vast and alien and utterly indifferent to human concerns about mortality or suffering. You stand at the edge, the presence communicated without language, neither fully departed nor capable of return. The bond with the Omega creates possibility, but possibility requires price. Always price. Nothing is given freely in exchanges between life and death. What price? Draven's response came automatically despite lacking vocal cords or breath to form words. The curse that runs through her bloodline exists because her ancestors made similar bargains, traded sight for perception beyond normal senses, traded physical vision for ability to see truths others miss. The blindness is not punishment, it is exchange. Power requires sacrifice of something equal. Draven processed this, understanding crystallizing despite the alien nature of the communication. You're saying Celine's blindness is the cost of her empathic abilities, that her family curse is actually a gift disguised as disability. All curses are gifts seen through improper lens. All gifts become curses when misunderstood. The presence shifted, attention focusing more directly on him. You have different choice, different price. Return to life, but sacrifice what made you the Iron Wolf. Return transformed into something that cannot rule through fear because fear will no longer be available as weapon. What does that mean? It means the parts of you that killed without hesitation, that calculated human lives as strategic resources, that prioritized power over connection. Those parts burn away in the resurrection. You return human in ways you have not been human since childhood. Vulnerable, incapable of the casual brutality that built your empire. Changed fundamentally. So I come back weaker. You come back whole. Weakness and wholeness are different concepts despite surface similarity. The presence paused, considering. The Omega calls for you. Her grief creates resonance strong enough to anchor your consciousness despite biological cessation. Bond between you exceeds normal mate connections, approaches something older, something the modern wolves have forgotten how to recognize. What happens if I refuse? If I just let death be death? Then you end, clean, final, no continuation, no transformation, just absence where presence existed. The presence communicated acceptance rather than judgment. That is legitimate choice. Death is always available, requires no bargaining or sacrifice. Simply surrender to the inevitable and cease. And Celine continues without you. Grieves, eventually heals, finds different life than she would have lived with you present. Her path continues regardless of your choice. Draven floated in this darkness, weighing options that felt impossibly consequential. 9 years ago, he would have rejected transformation without hesitation. Would have chosen death over weakness, annihilation over vulnerability, ending over change that threatened his capacity for dominance. But 9 years ago, he hadn't met Celine, hadn't remembered what it felt like to be human instead of just functional, hadn't discovered that connection mattered more than control. The truth about power that no one taught rulers was this: strength without humanity was just successful violence. Dominance without connection was isolation wearing a crown. Building empires meant nothing if you destroyed yourself in the process. He'd learned that lesson written in blood and silver poisoning, and the desperate realization that dying alone was the natural consequence of living alone. If I return changed, can I still protect her? Still be what she needs? Protection takes many forms. The brutality you wielded was one form, not the only form. Perhaps not even the most effective form for someone whose greatest vulnerabilities are not physical. The presence shifted again, preparing to withdraw. Choice must be made quickly. Biology progresses toward irreversible cessation. Window closes. Draven thought of Celine crying over his body, blamed herself for his death, carrying guilt she didn't deserve because he'd chosen to fight rather than flee. Thought of her alone in a kingdom that would treat her blindness as weakness rather than recognizing her strength. Thought of her surviving, but always wondering whether things could have been different if he'd just survived those final moments. That future felt worse than any transformation. Bring me back. Whatever the cost. Whatever I become. Just bring me back. The presence acknowledged his choice with satisfaction that suggested this had been the desired outcome from the beginning. Then pay the price willingly. Release the Iron Wolf. Surrender the capacity for casual cruelty. Accept that you will never again rule through fear because the parts of you that generated that fear are being burned away in the resurrection. Draven felt something tearing inside him, excision of fundamental aspects of his personality that had defined him for decades. The cold calculation that assessed human lives as strategic resources. The capacity for violence without guilt or hesitation. The instinctive dominance that made submission feel like weakness worth destroying. All of it ripping away like flesh being flayed from bone, painful beyond description but necessary for the transformation being forced upon him. He screamed without voice in darkness, without physical presence, consciousness fragmenting under the weight of change being implemented at levels deeper than thought or memory. And then light exploded through the darkness, and sensation returned with overwhelming intensity. Pain first. His body remembering trauma, silver poisoning, injuries that should have killed him. Then sound, Celine sobbing his name, voice raw from screaming. Finally, physical sensation, her hands on his chest, feeling for heartbeat that had stopped minutes ago. Draven gasped, lungs dragging in air with desperate violence. His heart stuttered, then caught rhythm, beating irregularly but functional. Blood that had stopped circulating resumed flowing through veins that had begun the process of post-mortem coagulation. He was alive. Changed, damaged, fundamentally altered, at levels he couldn't yet comprehend, but alive. Celine's crying stopped mid-sob, hands pressing harder against his chest where impossible heartbeat had resumed. Her face was a mixture of disbelief and desperate hope, tears streaming down cheeks, breath coming in ragged gasps. Draven? Her voice cracked on his name. Please don't be imagination. Please don't be me going insane from grief. Not imagination. He forced words through a throat that felt like it had been shredded from the inside. Alive, somehow. Don't ask me how, because I don't fully understand it myself. She collapsed against him, sobbing with relief so profound it shook her entire body. He wrapped arms around her despite the pain radiating from every nerve ending, holding her while she cried out terror and grief, and the particular anguish of losing someone and then having them return from the absolute edge of permanent absence. You were dead. Your heart stopped. I felt it stop. How, magic. Old magic tied to your bloodline and whatever bond exists between us. Draven spoke carefully, testing whether his mind still functioned correctly after whatever transformation had been forced upon him. Something made a bargain on my behalf. Brought me back at a cost I'm only beginning to understand. What cost? I'll figure that out later. Right now, I just need to confirm this is real and not some dying hallucination my brain constructed to make cessation easier. It's real. I'm real. You're alive. Celine pulled back slightly, hands finding his face and tracing features with the kind of desperate verification that suggested she didn't trust her other senses. Whatever happened, whatever bargain was made, we'll deal with the consequences together. Behind them, sounds of approaching footsteps signaled that their moment of privacy was ending. Guards would arrive soon, drawn by the disturbance and the impossible resurrection occurring on the eastern balcony. Malric would need to be dealt with. The power vacuum Draven had created by abdicating would need resolution. The kingdom would demand answers about what happened and why their dead king was suddenly breathing again. But all of that felt distant and manageable compared to the immediate reality of existing again, of having a second chance at life he'd thrown away through 9 years of isolation and paranoid brutality. Can you stand? Celine asked, already trying to help him upright. We need to move before what? Before they arrest us? Execute us for crimes real and imagined? Draven let her pull him to his feet, body protesting every movement but functional enough for basic locomotion. I gave up the crown, Celine. I don't have authority anymore. I'm just a wolf who happened to survive what should have been fatal. You're never just anything. She guided him toward the corridor entrance, moving with confidence despite her blindness. You're the person who unified this kingdom, who built infrastructure and eliminated territorial wars, who made survival possible for millions of people, even if your methods were brutal. That doesn't disappear because you abdicated. It should disappear. That's the whole point of giving up power. You stop being the person defined by it. They reached the corridor as guards rounded the corner, weapons drawn, expressions shifting from alert to confused when they recognized who they were seeing. The dead king walking, covered in blood and barely standing, supported by a blind Omega, who somehow projected more authority than any of the armed soldiers present. Stand down, Draven said, voice carrying command despite his compromised state. I have no quarrel with any of you. I abdicated. The crown is no longer mine to claim or defend. We're just two people trying to leave before the situation becomes more complicated than necessary. The guards exchanged uncertain glances, caught between competing authorities and unclear chain of command. One stepped forward, younger wolf with idealism still visible despite military training. Your Majesty, Lord Malric is calling for your arrest. Says you're a threat to kingdom stability and need to be contained until proper authorities determine your fate. Lord Malric was half dead on the throne room floor last I checked. Draven met the young guard's eyes. Tell him that if he wants me arrested, he's welcome to try enforcing that order personally, but I suspect he's currently more focused on not bleeding out than on maintaining authority over someone who voluntarily gave up power. What do we tell him about you being alive? Another guard asked, confusion evident in his voice. You were dead. Multiple witnesses confirmed it. How do we explain resurrection? You don't explain it. You just acknowledge that reality is more complicated than military training prepared you for. Draven moved past them, Celine matching his pace. Some things don't have explanations that fit into official reports. This is one of them. They walked through corridors that Draven had traversed as king, as conqueror, as the iron wolf who ruled through calculated fear. But everything felt different now. The fortress was the same. The stones hadn't changed. The architecture remained identical. He was what had changed. Where the old Draven would have calculated defensive positions and potential ambush points, the new version just walked. Where the Iron Wolf would have assessed each person they passed as potential threat or ally, Draven now saw them as just people navigating their own complicated existences. Where the paranoid ruler would have planned contingencies and backup strategies, he now focused on the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other while his body remembered how to function. The transformation the ancient presence had forced upon him wasn't just philosophical. It was neurological, fundamental rewiring of instincts and responses that had defined him for decades. The capacity for casual violence had been